Turtles games, they can be amazing at times, can't they? And today we're diving headfirst into the ooze-soaked sewers of nostalgia. But just to be clear, this isn't just any video. Oh no, this is an epic deep dive, a marathon journey through the entire classic era of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles video game franchise. From the quarter-devouring brilliance of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, to the time-warping chaos of Turtles in Time, the criminally overlooked Manhattan missions, and even the fan-built love letter that is Rescue Palooza. Along the way, we'll uncover how these iconic titles shaped a generation, inspired legions of imitators, and laid the foundation for modern homages like Shredder's Revenge. So strap in, grab a slice of pizza, and prepare for one of the longest, loudest, and most monstrous uploads I've ever created. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the ultimate history of Turtle Power. Cowabunga! Yeah! With the 16-bit console wars raging, the early 90s were a glorious time to be a gamer, and the best part, thanks to my links below, you can relive that golden era yourself for next to nothing. Pick up Marvel vs Capcom Fighting Collection with 61% off, enjoy up to 80% off the Capcom Fighting Collections and Beat 'em Up Bundle, 78% off the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, 78% off the Cowabunga Collection, and plenty more. If you love gaming history, you won't be disappointed. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy this ultra-long dive into the bloody beginnings of the Turtles. The original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game, released by Konami in 1989, remains one of the most iconic beat-em-ups of its era. It landed at exactly the right moment, right as Turtle Mania was sweeping across the globe, and gave fans the fantasy they'd always dreamed of, stepping into the shells of Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Rembrandt, battling their way through hordes of foot soldiers, mutants, and machines to save April O'Neil and Master Splinter. For many, it wasn't just a game, it was a playable cartoon bursting with vibrant colours, expressive character sprites, and faithful animations that perfectly captured the energy and humour of a TV show. What really made the game so beloved was its frantic 4-player co-op gameplay, in an era when most arcade cabinets were still offering solo or 2-player experiences. The chance to team up with 3 mates and tackle waves of enemies together was thrilling. Each turtle had their own fighting style, weapon reach, and subtle differences in speed, which added a slight tactical element to the chaos. The controls were simple and intuitive: jump, attack, and a special move, but the sheer volume of enemies on screen and the smooth scrolling action kept players engaged and pummeling coins from start to finish. I'm not surprised people loved this title so much, as beyond the mechanics there was just something joyful about the game's tone. It embraced the campy Saturday morning cartoon feel without being patronising or dull. Levels were diverse and well paced, the soundtrack was catchy and energetic, and the boss fights against the likes of Bebop, Rocksteady, and Shredder himself were memorable and often genuinely challenging. It was a pure distillation of what made the Ninja Turtles popular in the first place: teamwork, attitude, and relentless action. Even today, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game is remembered fondly not just as a great licensed title, but as one of the best beat-em-ups of the golden age of arcades. When talking about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game on the NES, let's begin with the most obvious flaw. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 is repetitive, mind-numbingly so. It's essentially a straight line from left to right, mashing the B button as wave after wave of palette-swapped foot soldiers waltz in for their scheduled thrashing. No puzzles, no exploration, no decisions, just the same basic enemies reappearing in different colours and with slightly altered attacks, stretching out what should have been a brisk thrill ride into a sluggish slog. Now, to be clear, yes, this is a port of the original arcade game, but something crucial was lost in translation. The NES simply didn't have the horsepower to match the arcade game's original speed, sound, and spectacle. Gone are the crisp animations, the layered backdrops bustling with detail, and the 4-player mayhem that made the arcade cabinet so unforgettable. What felt like thrilling chaos in the arcade, loud, bright, and social, becomes a much quieter, lonelier grind on the NES. You're still fighting the same enemies in the same order, but without the visual flair, dynamic soundscape, or explosive pace to distract you. The repetition is suddenly front and centre. It doesn't feel like a team effort anymore. It feels like a chore. Sure, 2-player action is better than none, but let's not forget there were 4 Ninja Turtles. and being able to team up with all of them at the same time is part of what made the original arcade game so spectacular. Compared to the first NES Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, often mocked for its difficulty, yes, but at least structurally it's ambitious. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 feels almost insultingly stripped back. The original game included an overworld map, sewer navigation, underwater bomb defusal segments, and distinct turtle stats that actually made each brother feel different in battle. Donatello's long reach genuinely changed how you approach certain enemies. In Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, pick whoever, they're essentially cosmetic swaps. It's a classic arcade style brawler, but robbed of the arcade's most important feature: atmosphere. On the NES, stripped of its context, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 exposes the hollowness at its core. A flashy crowd pleaser, perhaps, but not one built to last once the novelty fades. Stripped of its arcade gloss, the arcade game on the NES starts to resemble your typical licensed game of the late 80s and early 90s. A shallow, repetitive, cash-in banking on brand recognition rather than delivering a truly memorable experience. There is little reason to go back and revisit it today, as it plays things painfully safe, offering no real innovation or depth, just endless enemy waves and the hope that slapping the Ninja Turtles logo on the box would be enough to make fans overlook its bland design. In this light, it fits neatly alongside the countless other licensed titles of the era. Visually faithful, sure, but ultimately disposable. While this game is certainly an admirable attempt to bring that arcade magic into our humble living rooms, it quickly becomes obvious that the 8-bit toaster just wasn't up to the task. What we've ended up with was a stripped back, clunky and painfully compromised imitation. Animations were drastically slashed, attacks that were once fluid became stiff, robotic affairs. When playing the game, the turtles look more like they're flailing pool noodles than swinging deadly weapons. What's worse is that frame rates dip into single digits during the more chaotic segments, and the combat, which feels satisfying and impactful in the real arcade game, feels more like guesswork in this iteration. For those trying this out for the first time today, when controlling the turtles, you'll be asking yourself, will your hit land? Will it clip through the enemy? Only the NES knows, and it isn't telling you. Then there's the performance. Good lord! The NES already struggled with rendering too many sprites on screen, but when you added a second player into the mix, you'd better be prepared for a slideshow! Flickering sprites, screen tearing, and input lag galore. What's meant to be a glorious couch co-op ends up looking like the cartridge is being powered by a potato wearing a blindfold. It doesn't just chug, it's practically coughing up smoke. And for those expecting the arcade's crisp, booming soundtrack, the NES sound chip does its best, bless its little silicon heart, but it's a bit like trying to recreate a rock concert using a kazoo and a broken music box. The melodies are technically there, but the energy and punch are long gone. So yes, while the arcade version was a visual and auditory feast, the NES version is more of a lukewarm leftover, reheated, rubbery, and noticeably uncooked. Yes, defenders will inevitably chime in, but the NES version had extra levels. And they're right, it did. 2 of them, in fact. Added specifically to pad out the home release and offer something fresh for returning arcade fans. But let's not pretend these additions elevate the experience in any meaningful way. These bonus stages are not bold reinventions or creative detours. They're more of the same conveyor belts, more predictable enemy waves, and more hollow boss fights that feel like lightly reskinned echoes of earlier encounters. It's the game equivalent of slapping a piece of limp lettuce onto a sandwich made of styrofoam and proudly declaring it's gourmet. Sure, it's technically different, but does it improve the flavour? Not even remotely. A longer, bland experience is still, well, a bland experience. More levels don't solve the core issue, that the gameplay loop wears thin within minutes, and padding it out just makes the tedium more obvious. And let's not kid ourselves, there is literally no reason to play this game anymore, especially now we have the arcade version at our fingertips. For this reason, I'd much rather power up the NES original. That earlier title, for all its faults, had a distinct identity. It wasn't afraid to throw players into the deep end with giant fire monsters, creepy underground lairs, and bosses that looked like they'd crawled out of a fever dream. It felt unpredictable, almost experimental, like someone had been given the Turtles license and a free pass to go absolutely mad with it. By contrast, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 plays it painfully straight. It ditches the weird and wonderful in favour of sterile. Sure, you could argue it's more on brand with a TV show, clean, colourful and recognisable, but in doing so it trades away all of its personality for a thin coat of polish. It's safer, brighter, more marketable, but infinitely more boring. Where the first game was rough around the edges but brimming with bizarre energy. In my opinion, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a textbook example of playing it safe, and in the process, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 feels like it was built in a boardroom, predictable to the point of lifelessness, and utterly incapable of surprising you. I completely understand why Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, would have been a favourite for kids back in the day. It had the turtles, it looked and sounded close enough to the cartoon, and it let you and a mate beat up bad guys for hours on end. What more could a young fan ask for? At the time, just having a recognisable franchise faithfully recreated on a home console was enough to blow minds. But viewed through an adult lens, or even compared to its contemporaries, it becomes clear that nostalgia is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Beneath the flashy license is a game that's mechanically shallow, relentlessly repetitive, and afraid to take any risks. The kind of title you remember fondly, but struggle to enjoy once the rose-tinted glasses come off. Due to this, the original NES Turtles game has arguably aged better. Not because it was more polished or easier to play, it absolutely wasn't, but because it had ambition. It dared to do something different. It wasn't just a side-scrolling brawler, it was a weird, sprawling hybrid of action, platforming, exploration, and brutal challenge. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, in contrast, is smooth and inoffensive, but ultimately forgettable. You can finish it, put the controller down, and struggle to recall a single standout moment. Meanwhile, everyone remembers the damn level from the first game, for better or worse. It's the difference between a game that tried to be unique and one that simply aimed to replicate a proven formula. One aged into a relic worth revisiting, the other became background noise in the annals of NES history. Turtles in Time, the crown jewel of Konami's arcade empire, and a game that encapsulates everything brilliant about early 90s gaming culture. But before we get carried away with time-travelling pirate ships and sewer hoverboards, let's take a brief step back to see how we got here. Because the road to Turtles in Time wasn't always paved with pepperoni. The first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game arrived in 1989, a strange NES hybrid of top-down exploration and side-scrolling action. Ambitious, yes, but also notoriously unforgiving. It sold well, but most kids remember it less for beating Shredder and more for drowning in that infamous dam level. Then came Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, and suddenly everything clicked. Gone were the awkward mechanics and tonal confusion, in their place was a slick, energetic brawler that captured the cartoon spirit perfectly. The NES port did its best, but it was always chasing the high of the iconic 4-player arcade cabinet that ate through pocket money alongside The Simpsons and X-Men. The franchise exploded from there, Game Boy spin-offs, PC ports, even pinball, but it was 1991's Turtles in Time that marked the true pinnacle. Built on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 arcade hardware, this wasn't just another tie-in, it was the definitive Ninja Turtles experience. A year later, the game hit the Super Nintendo with the slightly perplexing title of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, referencing the NES exclusive Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project. The odd naming of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo has confused plenty of fans over the years, but the reasoning behind it is surprisingly straightforward once you understand the release timeline. Today we shall look at and explore the quirks of both versions, but before we dive into how the Super Nintendo port handled all the time-hopping chaos, we need to go back to where it all began, the arcade original. And what a beginning it has! The game opens with a cutscene straight out of a Saturday morning fever dream. April O'Neil is mid-broadcast when Krang, piloting his massive exosuit, swoops in and swipes the entire Statue of Liberty. Seconds later, Shredder appears on screen with the kind of smug, scenery-chewing energy that could only belong to a cartoon villain. It's a simple premise, but one that perfectly sets the tone, silly, high-stakes and joyfully unhinged. The perfect start for what is now considered one of the most legendary and memorable arcade games of all time. One cool factoid regarding this game is that Konami released Turtles in Time in two distinct arcade cabinet formats, a standard 2-player setup and a deluxe 4-player version. The latter was the definitive experience, each turtle locked to a specific control station, encouraging players to claim their favourite before someone else grabbed Donatello and ruined your evening. All 4 turtles, Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo and Rembrandt, were of course playable. While they shared nearly identical sprites, a common cost-saving measure at the time. Each one had slightly different handling thanks to their unique weapons and subtly tweaked stats. The combat system was gloriously simple but deceptively rich. You had just 2 buttons, attack and jump, plus a joystick, but that basic setup allowed for surprising depth. Players could dash, perform sliding tackles, chain jump kicks, and even unleash special attacks that, in later versions, would drain a bit of health to prevent abuse. But the move that really stuck in players' memories was hurling foot soldiers directly into the screen. It was a cheeky, fourth wall breaking flourish that felt like a precursor to Mode 7, even though this was an arcade game, not a Super Nintendo title. Not only did it look cool, but it turned an otherwise straightforward throw into one of the most iconic and innovative mechanics in beat-em-up history. Turtles in Time followed the now iconic Konami formula, honed through earlier 4-player brawlers like The Simpsons and X-Men. These weren't just spiritual siblings, they were mechanical cousins, built on the same original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles based arcade hardware. This shared foundation was engineered to handle large, vibrant sprites with smooth animations and minimal slowdown, even during chaotic on-screen battles. So if Turtles in Time ever felt like it played a lot like the Simpsons arcade game, that's no coincidence. Under the hood, they were practically twins. The soundtrack for Turtles in Time absolutely slaps, and it should, given the pedigree behind it. The arcade original was composed by Matsuhiko Izumi, a Konami legend also known for his work on Guitar Freaks and Dance Dance Revolution. The first level wastes no time dropping you into the action, kicking things off in the steam-filled, neon-soaked streets of New York City. It's the classic urban beat-em-up opener, alleyways, scaffolding, and foot soldiers pouring in from every direction. But Turtles in Time elevates the cliché by infusing it with personality, visual gags, expressive animations, and that unmistakable cartoon charm. Even in this opening stage, Konami starts layering in environmental hazards that add variety and challenge. Crashing wrecking balls, explosive barrels, and Krang swooping in to fire lasers across the screen. It's all delivered under the guise of fun chaos, but it's secretly a tutorial, teaching you to dodge, adapt, and stay mobile, or risk becoming Turtle Soup by stage 2. From the outset, Turtles in Time sets itself apart from the flood of button-mashing brawlers. It's not just polished, it's packed with style, humour, and smart pacing, proving that Konami knew how to take a genre template and crank it up to 11. No wonder this title is so beloved. Naturally, this stage culminates in a boss fight, and it's no throwaway. You're launched into a mid-air showdown with Baxter Stockman, now in full mutant fly mode. He zips across the screen in jittery patterns, spraying projectiles and refusing to sit still. It's a sharp contrast to the predictable grunt fights you've just been through, and an early sign that boss encounters in this game won't be mere palette swaps. But of course, this is only the beginning of this unforgettable journey. Next up on our sewer surfing tour, Alley Cat Blues, a grime-caked back alley that swaps Times Square's flashy neon for flickering street lamps and overflowing skips. This is where the level design starts to flex a little more creatively. Enemies pour out of stairwells, leap from rooftops, and generally skulk around like the kind of loiterers that would have Splinter filing a health and safety complaint. The stage captures peak 90s urban grit, busted hydrants, graffiti-covered walls, and enough scattered rubbish to qualify as a minor environmental disaster. It's scrappy, but all the more endearing for it. Enemy variety also gets a much-needed shake-up here. Alongside the usual palette-swapped foot soldiers are bizarre robotic foes wearing boxing gloves, a baffling but oddly fitting addition that feels like Mega Man wandered into a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fever dream. It's ridiculous, it's brilliant, it's exactly the kind of nonsense the game thrives on. This one culminates in a battle against Metalhead, the Turtles' robotic doppelganger. Unlike the mindless goons you've smashed through up to this point, Metalhead actually fights back with intelligence. He zips around the screen, blends melee and ranged attacks, and forces players to ditch the mindless button mashing in favour of a more tactical approach. It's a noticeable difficulty spike, and a welcome one. Then of course it's time to head underground. The sewers are practically home turf for our green heroes, but Konami gives this familiar setting a futuristic twist. Rather than skateboards, the Turtles now cruise through the muck on glowing neon hoverboards, because this was 1991, and why not? This is the first auto-scrolling stage in the game, and with it comes a sudden tempo shift. Players now have to juggle dodging fast-moving hazards, blocking aerial attacks, and generally staying on their toes. It's chaotic, unrelenting, and a brilliant way to break up the rhythm of traditional beat-em-up levels. The stage ends with a relatively forgettable boss, more of a cooldown than a challenge, but it serves a purpose, because just as you're catching your breath, the plot swerves hard. Shredder shows up looking like he's just returned from a quantum leap binge, and with a maniacal grin hails the Turtles 25 million years into the past. Because if Turtles in Time hadn't already made its central theme crystal clear, it's about to. With a dramatic cutscene, the game finally cashes in on its title. The skyscrapers and steam vents of New York City vanish in an instant as the Turtles hurtle backwards through time, landing shell first into the primeval chaos of prehistoric Turtlesaurus. And yes, it's a jungle out there. Literally. The entire stage feels like it was plucked straight from Cadillacs and dinosaurs, with dense foliage, cloudy ash skies, and enemy foot soldiers now absurdly mounted on pterodactyls. Because of course they are! These airborne dinos aren't just for show either. They gleefully drop rocks on your head, triggering flashbacks to the worst kind of Mega Man aerial trollery. You know the type. As you brawl your way forward, the environment transitions from jungle to a molten lava-scorched battlefield. The stage culminates in a scrap against Cement Man, the hulking grey-skinned mutant with a body made of living concrete. This fight rewards patience and positioning more than brute force. Flanking is key. It's a shift from the usual beat-em-up boss logic of hit until it falls down. Once the prehistoric menace is defeated, it's straight into the next time vortex. This time to the high seas of 1530 AD for Skull and Crossbones. Set aboard a creaky pirate ship, this stage is full of booming cannons, rotting timber, and foot soldiers now decked out in their finest Poundland pirate cosplay. The real highlight here, a tag team boss fight against Toka and Razor. It's the first proper 2-on-1 encounter in the game. Well, unless you're playing 2 or 4 player mode, that is. And it ramps up both the challenge and spectacle. The kiddie gloves are off, you're in the deep end now. But the adventure is far from over yet. Next up, a ride into the Wild West. Stage 6 whisks the Turtles to 1885 in a sepia-toned, side-scrolling showdown atop a hurtling freight train. The background whips by at speed, while the subtly bobbing floor gives the illusion of motion, an impressive touch for 1991. Foot soldiers dressed as bandits leap aboard from horseback like it's a Sunset Riders crossover episode, which amusingly also released that same year. Konami's synergy at its finest. And once you've kicked enough bandits' butt and dealt with the train top boss, it's time to leap forward again into the far future of, checks notes, 2020. Now 2020 might not feel particularly futuristic anymore, especially considering a lot of us spent most of the year indoors having a pint and waiting for it all to blow over. But back in 1991, it sounded like we'd all be zipping around on hoverboards and living on the moon. To Konami's credit, they leaned into that sci-fi optimism with both feet. This stage serves as a high-tech echo of the earlier sewer surfing level, only now the hoverboards actually hover. Enemies are armed with laser blasters, and the speed is relentless. It plays like a turbocharged homage to Back to the Future Part 2, a loving tribute to an era when the future still felt wide open, and a gentle reminder that science still owes us all a hoverboard. The stage ends with a high-stake rematch with Krang in his towering exosuit. Defeat him and the Turtles are flung even further through the time stream, this time to the ludicrously advanced year of 2100. Realistically, we'll be lucky if we still have electricity, drinkable water, and a functioning internet that isn't 90% AI-generated content created in Pakistan by that point. And the closest we'll get to cyborg ninjas, an Amazon delivery drone that mistakes your nan for a thief. But in the case of this game, Konami's imagination doesn't hold back. Their vision of 2100 is a chrome-coated fever dream, gleaming corridors, blinking control panels, Death Star vistas, and every sci-fi trope crammed onto a PCB like it was a final year film student's homage to Star Wars. It's wonderfully absurd, but it works. As the last leg of the Turtles' time-hopping quest, it ramps the chaos to its peak. The climax, one last brawl with Krang, this time stripped of his mech and fighting on foot, before the Turtles are finally hurled back to their own time. And that leads us to the grand finale, a showdown with Shredder himself. No hoverboards, no laser beams, no prehistoric reptiles or pirate ships. Just 4 turtles, 1 iconic villain, and the Statue of Liberty standing tall in the background, bringing the entire time warp journey full circle. What started with Krang nicking America's most recognisable landmark ends with her standing proudly once again, as if to say, cheers lads, you've done your civic duty. The closing cutscene delivers a suitably patriotic bow, complete with a news report celebrating the Turtles' heroic efforts to save the city. But political side-eyes aside, let's talk about what else made this arcade version so memorable. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in Time wasn't just a decent licensed game. It was a legitimately brilliant arcade experience by any standard. With punchy cartoon faithful visuals, a control scheme tighter than Rembrandt's headband, and a soundtrack bursting with Saturday morning chaos, it was effortlessly accessible and instantly addictive. You didn't need a manual, you just walked up, slapped a coin in, and started drop-kicking foot soldiers like it was your civic duty. More importantly, this wasn't just a reskin version of Konami's earlier Turtles game. Everything was sharper: the combat, the stage design, the music, and the gimmicks. Inspired. Tossing enemies at a screen wasn't just funny, it was iconic. It felt innovative, fresh, and more than a little cheeky. Critics noticed, fans noticed, and the result, Konami's best-selling arcade game of its time. Not bad for a title starring sewer-dwelling reptiles with a pizza addiction and a vocabulary ripped straight from Bill and Ted. But here's the twist. Despite being built to guzzle coins on the sticky floors of Funland and every seaside pier in the UK, Turtles in Time was destined for something more. In 1992, it made the leap to the Super Nintendo, and that, dear viewers, is where things get interesting. Because while the Super Nintendo version looks like Turtles in Time, and sounds like Turtles in Time, and yes, even feels like Turtles in Time, it's also very much its own beast. Right out of the gate, the limitations of the hardware are apparent. Sprites are a little smaller, animation frames are a little choppier, and the once bustling enemy waves are cut down to a more modest 4 or 5 on screen. The rich layered backgrounds of the arcade cabinet now flatter, more restrained, like someone gave your imagination a budget and a bedtime. It's the kind of visual compromise you'd expect from any early 90s arcade to console port. Like Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo, it's absolutely still worth playing. It just doesn't punch you in the face with a spectacle quite the same way. And let's be real, if you wanted arcade perfection at home in 1992, you needed rich parents and a Neo Geo. The rest of us made do with a slightly squashed Turtles and called it a win. Of course, the multiplayer also took a bit of a knock. While the arcade let 4 players bash foot soldiers shoulder to shoulder in pure pizza fuel chaos, the Super Nintendo trims that back to just 2. It's not a deal breaker, but it definitely changes the vibe from a noisy full-blown party brawler to more of a me and my mate against the world affair. And yet, despite the hardware limitations, this isn't just a watered-down version of the arcade original, because Konami didn't simply shrink the game to fit in a cartridge. They reworked it, reimagined it, and in some places, they absolutely nailed it. When the game made its leap to the SNES, the music was rearranged by Kazuhiko Uehara and Harumi Iko, both veterans of Konami's golden era and familiar names for Tournament Fighters fans. Each stage track brings its own flavour, energetic, catchy, and steeped in that Saturday morning cartoon chaos. It's not quite Chrono Trigger or Sonic 2 levels of iconic, but for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it hits the mark. Changes can be found across the board. Take stage 3. On the surface, it looks like a straight adaptation of the arcade sewer surfing gauntlet. Same hoverboards, same high-speed dodging. But get to the end, and surprise! The boss fight's completely different. It's a small but telling change, an early sign that this port isn't just copying the arcade beat for beat, but remixing it with intention. Then there's the Technodrome, a full-blown exclusive stage for the Super Nintendo version and a proper showstopper. This sprawling mechanical hellscape is packed with robotic enemies, conveyor belts, and a mid-stage ambush by Toka and Razor, bosses who didn't show up until much later in the arcade version. Their earlier arrival here makes for a brutal wake-up call. But the level doesn't stop flexing there. It also features a classic beat-em-up elevator sequence, one of those rising platforms where enemies rain down from all directions. Weirdly, the arcade version skipped this trope entirely, making its appearance here feel like a smart, almost overdue inclusion. And when you reach the top, you're met with one of the Super Nintendo port's boldest changes, a first-person style boss fight against Shredder, who lobs projectiles at you from a vantage point as you chuck foot soldiers directly at the screen to fight back. It's weird, it's clunky, it's inspired. A strange little experiment that somehow works and frustrates in equal measures. These creative flourishes pop up again and again through the Super Nintendo version. It's less a direct port and more of a director's cut, pared back in places, sure, but often bolder, weirder, and occasionally better. Because when arcade developers were usually just trimming games down for home use, Konami looked at the Super Nintendo and went, right lads, let's remix things, and thank God they did. This kind of creative tinkering pops up throughout the SNES version. Take the prehistoric stage. Once again, the boss fight gets swapped out. Some players might favour the arcade's tougher, more strategic Cement Man, but that's beside the point. What matters is that Konami didn't just slap the original content onto a cartridge and call it a day. They shuffled the deck, took some risks and tested new ideas. Even Skull and Crossbones gets a notable remix, with Toku and Razor already dealt with in the Technodrome. Who steps in to swap the decks? None other than Rocksteady and Bebop, cosplaying as pirates complete with swords, hats, and the kind of confused menace that can only come from two henchmen wondering how they got here. It's ridiculous, it's glorious, it's exactly what you want from a 90s Ninja Turtles game. A surprise to be sure, but well, you know the rest. The Western train stage is mostly faithful to its arcade roots, but after that, the SNES version throws in a brand new surprise, a futuristic stage built specifically to show off the console's Mode 7 capabilities. The whole level plays out like a zero-gravity brawl across a distorted, shifting landscape. Backgrounds twist and scour beneath your feet in ways that would have melted minds back in '92. It's flashy, it's slightly gimmicky, and it's completely exclusive to the home release. From there, it's onto the penultimate showdown with Krang, an encounter similar to his arcade Stage 5 appearance, but now set within the newly minted Futurescape. Then finally, we arrive at the last stop of this time-travelling tour, the Star Base. Or as I like to call it, Star Killer Base before J.J. Abrams could ruin it. This metallic nightmare is your final gauntlet, and Konami makes it count. First, another fight with Krang, just to be sure he's thoroughly flattened, and then the big one, Shredder. But not the standard issue version, no, this Shredder has hit the gym. Added some steel-plated flair, and shows up looking like a mutant mashup of Kevin Nash and Lord Zed. The infamous Super Shredder. He's massive, he's angry, and he's clearly not here for polite conversations. But once you manage to blow out his quads, the game is over. And that, dear viewers, is the Super Nintendo version of Turtles in Time. Does it match the arcade original blow for blow? Not quite. The graphics are scaled down. The 4-player chaos is trimmed to 2. The sheer bombast is dialed back just a notch. But this isn't a straight downgrade. It's a thoughtful, confident reimagining. New stages, boss swaps, inventive use of hardware tricks. It's clear that Konami didn't just port Turtles in Time to the Super Nintendo, they recrafted it, and in doing so they delivered one of the most impressive arcade to home conversions of the 16-bit era. A game that, even in a crowded genre, still manages to stand tall, shells, swords, surface slang and all. Cowabunga indeed. Critics at the time loved it. Electronic Gaming Monthly handed the SNES version a glowing 9 out of 10, applauding its faithful gameplay, inventive additions, and the way it captured the heart and humour of the arcade original. The only real ding, it was maybe a little too easy, which for a game about mutant reptiles fighting robots hardly seemed like a deal breaker. All game praised the visuals, highlighting just how closely they mimicked the animated series look and feel, while the soundtrack and sound effects received similarly enthusiastic nods. Nintendojo went all in, boldly declaring it the greatest Ninja Turtles game ever made, but perhaps Entertainment Weekly summed it up best. The Turtles may have peaked on the big screen, but in video game land they're just reaching their potential. And honestly, they weren't wrong. So now that we've rummaged through both incarnations of this classic, the arcade's explosive coin-gobbling chaos, and the Super Nintendo's lovingly remixed home edition, it's time to answer the big question. Which version of Turtles in Time actually hits harder? Or maybe the real question is, does it even matter when both still hit different? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a game, it's a memory. A pizza-scented portal back to CRT screens, sticky arcade carpets, and pure unfiltered joy of drop-kicking foot soldiers with your best mate. Whether you've played it with 4 players crammed around an arcade cab, or 2 kids huddled in front of a telly on a Saturday morning, Turtles in Time wasn't just another brawler. It's one of the greatest of all time, and for that reason, we will always celebrate it. The Turtles' first outing on the NES came in 1989 with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or as it was known in Japan, Gekikami Ninja Den, which loosely translates to Fierce Turtle Legend. No mention of mutant ninjas there. This version was a well-known hybrid platformer with the quirky overhead map that continues to polarise the fandom to this day. Released that same year, many preferred the 1989 arcade release, the 4-player side-scrolling brawler full of colour, chaos and authentic cartoon flair. In 1990 it was ported to the NES as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, which lots of people believe to be a solid effort, though severely scaled back due to the NES's hardware limitations. Then, in 1991, things get confusing. Japan received a brand new NES exclusive Turtles game on December 13th, titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 The Manhattan Project. That's right, 2, because they didn't get the arcade port until later, so this was technically only their second NES Turtles game on the hardware. I'm not sure what's more shocking, seeing the games appear in a completely different order, or the fact they still called it the Manhattan Project despite it being, the code name for Japan's Darkest Hour. A bit like naming your kids' party game Operation Rolling Thunder. I mean, honestly, who signed off on that? Was there no one in the localization meeting who raised a hand and went, "Hang on lads, maybe naming a fun beachside beat 'em up after a nuclear weapons program is a tad on the nose?" Obviously, no one spoke up. Meanwhile, over in North America, the very same game dropped in February 1992, where a bit more logic applied to the naming. It was released as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 The Manhattan Project, because for Western audiences, it was indeed the third NES outing for the Turtles. A rare display of chronological sanity in a naming saga that otherwise treats one of the most devastating chapters in modern history like a throwaway pun for Saturday morning entertainment. Europe, as usual, was left out in the cold. The game never received a PAL region release during the NES's original run. Unless you're imported or emulated, the Manhattan Project simply didn't exist. And if you only knew it from playground rumours, you could be forgiven for thinking it was some dodgy bootleg where Donatello discovers uranium. To make matters even more convoluted naming-wise, the Super Nintendo would later get Turtles in Time as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, even though arcade fans had already played it the years prior. To add to the fun, there was numbered handheld titles in the mix too, but let's not lose our minds. The point is, if you're confused by the titles, you're not alone. Even the Turtles themselves probably had trouble remembering what games they were in. So now that we've navigated the timeline like it's a sewer map drawn by a lunatic, let's talk about what makes the Manhattan Project different. Unlike its older siblings, the arcade port that limped onto the NES, the Manhattan Project wasn't trying to squeeze a big flashy cabinet down into an 8-bit shoebox. This wasn't a port, this was built from the ground up, exclusively for the NES, and it shows. It was developed by Konami's B Team, a charmingly named unit called Team Kuneru Asobu, which roughly translates to Eat, Sleep, Play, a fitting name for a squad still squeezing the last drops of magic out of the NES while the rest of the company had already jumped ship to the Super Nintendo. Despite playing second fiddle, this so-called B Team absolutely punched above their weight. The programming was handled by Satoshi Kishiwada, Takashi Kondo, and Yasuhiro Yamamoto. The visuals came courtesy of Konami's in-house pixel wizards, Yasuji Terada, Tetsuru Iguchi, Tetsuya Sato, Masaki Kishimoto, and Fumimasa Katakami. And the soundtrack, that was composed by Yuichi Sakakura, Tomoya Tomita, and Kozo Nakamura, who between them would go on to lend their musical talents to the likes of Castlevania and Goemon. In short, the Manhattan Project wasn't just some NES filler title, it was a well-oiled, late-generation showpiece built by a hungry team who weren't ready to let the NES go quietly into the night. And in many ways, it's better off for it. Free from the shackles of arcade legacy or Super Nintendo expectations, it became a pure NES experience, tailored to the system, designed to impress, and polished in a way that most third games in a trilogy rarely are. Mechanically, the Manhattan Project of course takes the core and sands off most of the rough edges. It still follows the familiar brawler formula, walk right, bash foot soldiers, repeat, but does so with noticeably more polish and technical depth. Each turtle plays largely the same in terms of speed and range, but they've now got individual special moves, performed by pressing B and A simultaneously. These flashy attacks deal extra damage and can clear groups of enemies but come at a cost. They drain a bit of your health unless you're already on your last hit point. A smart little risk-reward mechanic that adds some technical flair to the button mashing. There's also the return of a toss attack. By holding down on the D-pad and pressing B, your turtle can grab an enemy and hurl them across the screen. It's immensely satisfying, and unlike in the previous NES outing, this time it's baked directly into the combat system. No grappling required, just timing and distance. Simple, elegant, effective. Two-player co-op is back, of course, and this time with a choice. Do you want to accidentally beat the shell out of your mate mid-battle, or would you rather switch off friendly fire and keep things civil? The game lets you toggle it, and frankly, this tiny option makes it a better two-player experience than half the beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo. The control scheme is responsive, the movement is tight, and enemy variety ramps up at a steady pace. You even get to swap turtles between lives, so if your favourite ninja lizard gets flattened, you can tag in a fresh one, rather than being stuck sulking with Donatello while dreaming of Rembrandt. The Manhattan Project might not reinvent the genre, but what it does right. It's classic NES-era Konami, focused, refined, and built for repeat play. For a game released when the NES was about to be shoved off the shelf by the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive, the Manhattan Project is surprisingly ambitious. It's a bit like watching someone juggle chainsaws on a unicycle and realising halfway through that they're doing it on a trampoline. So let's dig even deeper into why this one's great. To do so, let's start with the obvious. The visuals! For NES standards, this thing looks brilliant! The turtles and enemies are large, detailed, and animate with a surprising amount of flair. Bosses like Rocksteady and Super Shredder are properly chunky, and the game even manages to throw multiple oversized sprites on screen at once without crashing into a flickery, seizure-inducing mess. Though yes, there's still flicker. It's the NES, not witchcraft. Unlike its predecessor, levels are more than just left to right corridors. Several feature multi-directional scrolling, downward sections on the beach, elevators, even some pseudo-vertical climbs. It's a level of environmental variety that most NES beat-em-ups didn't even attempt. There are also lovely little touches peppered throughout. Foot soldiers smash through glass windows, helicopter enemies drop troops onto rooftops, conveyor belts, lasers, trains, exploding scenery. It all adds to a welcome sense of chaos and texture. Audio-wise, it's peak Konami. The soundtrack slaps, to put it scientifically. The tunes make full use of the NES's primitive sound chip to deliver catchy, energetic tracks that match the on-screen carnage. Sound effects are chunky and satisfying with plenty of punch and just the right amount of crunch. But what makes the Manhattan Project truly special is that it never feels like it's pushing the hardware for the sake of it. Everything here, from the smooth animation to the scrolling tricks, is in service of making the game play better, feel better, and look more alive. If the NES had a victory lap, this would be it, and it's great right from the moment you hit start. The game opens in true Turtles fashion, with our heroes trying to enjoy a peaceful holiday in Florida, because nothing says ninja lifestyle like sunbathing in Key West. But before you can say past the factor 50, April O'Neil is kidnapped, again, and Manhattan is turned into a floating island by Shredder, again. I guess a standard Tuesday. Stage 1 kicks things off with a classic beach brawl, as foot soldiers storm the sands and the turtles return fire, this time in swim trunks. There's even a rare downward scrolling segment on the pier, a small but impressive technical flourish for the NES. At the end, Rocksteady shows up armed with a harpoon gun like he's trying out for Jaws 5 The Mutant Years. Then it's on to stage 2, Surfs Up, Foot Down, where the turtles hit the waves on hoverboards in a surprisingly smooth scrolling level. Foot soldiers leap from the sea with no explanation, as if they've been crouched on the seabed waiting for their cue. A flying foot soldier craft serves as the mini-boss, followed by a platform packed with turrets and Ground Chuck, who fights like Rocksteady after discovering whey protein. Stage 3 brings us to Bridge Mayhem, because no beat-em-up is complete without structurally questionable crossing. Slash makes his debut here as a mid-boss, followed by Bebop attacking from a vehicle, before later returning on foot with projectile attacks and spinning kicks, presumably after his ride failed its MOT. In Stage 4 we arrive at the floating city. Yes, Manhattan has apparently floated into the clouds for reasons that remain unexplained. There's a window-smashing foot soldier, park-based brawls, and even a quick underground sequence where a train barrels past mid-fight. Dirtbag shows up as the end boss, and no, that's not just what your ex called you in the divorce papers. Stage 5 is all about sewer shenanigans, because what would a Turtles game be without a healthy amount of raw sewage? This level breaks convention by scrolling in multiple directions, making it a genuinely non-linear stage on the NES. A foot soldier rides a robo-ostrich halfway through, as sure, why not, and Leatherhead closes the show with whip-like tail strikes and theatrical flair. Stage 6 is Technodrome Trouble, the obligatory visit to the Death Star's less hygienic cousin. Conveyor belts, lasers, robots, and a flood of foot soldiers fill the screen. Razor pops up with an ice attack or two before we face Shredder himself, who's keeping April suspended like some kind of Broadway hostage. Beats him, and as tradition demands, he legs it. Then comes stage 7, Live to the Top. No early 90s brawler would be complete without a legally mandated elevator level. This one offers a nice sunset over Manhattan, while helicopters periodically drop in more goons. Toka turns up at the top as the rooftop boss, ensuring your ascent doesn't end quietly. Stage 8 is the final showdown, set aboard Krang's spaceship, a chaotic sci-fi nightmare filled with traps, foot soldiers in overdrive and blaring music. Krang arrives in his mech war car, detaches his legs, and all hell breaks loose. Defeat him and we move on to the real finale. Enter Super Shredder. Beefier, angrier, and clearly no stranger to protein powder. It's Shredder 2.0, or as I like to call him, Kevin Nash with his quads and dignity still intact. After a tense final scrap, he explodes in suitably dramatic fashion and the Turtles save the day once again. If all that mutant mayhem sounds like a bit much, or you just want to skip straight to the bit where you slap Krang out of his bionic bloomers, good news, the Manhattan Project includes a built-in cheat code, and not just any cheat code, but the legendary Konami code itself, Cowabunga indeed. At the title screen, punch in up, up, down, down, left, right, be a start. Do this correctly and you'll unlock a hidden options menu. From here you can set your starting stage, increase your lives, tweak the difficulty, and even access full sound test. Ideal for pretending your NES is a malfunctioning jukebox. Interestingly, this code wasn't even needed in the Japanese version. They just gave you the options menu for free, which feels a bit like being told you don't need to find the walk whistle because the game's already offering you a lift. It's not often that the Japanese version of a game is easier, but it is in this rare case. I guess they just didn't want anyone completing it after hiring it from Blockbuster over the weekend. They wanted Americans to actually buy copies. Contemporary reviewers years later have been quietly impressed. GoodEvil.net rated it 83%, praising its refined gameplay and amazing graphics for an NES title. Critics noted the large, detailed sprites, vibrant backgrounds, and stage variety as standout features, especially considering the console's age at the time. Boss fights were frequently singled out as highlights, with animations and attack patterns lifted straight from the cartoons and comics. Even the difficulty was praised, described as brutal but fair, the kind of challenge that made victory feel earned, not handed to you in a pizza box. Reviewers appreciated how the special moves and toss mechanics added depth, and how each turtle's unique flair gave co-op sessions real replay value. Over time, this quiet praise snowballed into cult reverence. Retrospectives now regularly cite the Manhattan Project as the best Turtles game on the NES, and in some circles the best beat-em-up on the system. Full stop. It's a game that somehow managed to outshine its arcade predecessor by doing less with more. No 4-player cabinets, no flashy hardware, just good design, great music and solid gameplay. Before the Cowabunga collection, finding a working cartridge wasn't cheap. This game held its value for years, not because it was rare, but because it was loved. And when people talk about Konami's golden age, this is the kind of game they're referring to. Unpretentious, technically clever, and fun as hell. So what have we learned? I guess that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project, is a game trapped in a strange bit of history. Muddled numbering, regional weirdness, no arcade origins, and no flashy 16-bit debut. It was the middle child of the Turtles franchise, overlooked, underpromoted, and shoved out the door just as the NES was wheezing its last breath. And yet somehow, it might just be the best Turtles game Konami ever made exclusively for a home console. It's smartly designed, technically ambitious, and bursting with that late-era NES magic, when developers had truly figured out how to squeeze every ounce of power out of a little grey box. It improves on Turtles 2 in almost every way, holds up better than most licensed games of the era, and delivers an experience that's both mechanically sound and oozing with charm. Not bad for a game that never even made it to PAL territories the first time around. So whether you're discovering it for the first time through the Cowabunga collection, or digging it out of a shoebox with a smell of 1992 still clinging to the plastic, do yourself a favour, give the Manhattan Project a go. Because this isn't just a good Turtles game, it's one of the best reasons to still care about the NES. But then, in December of 1992, something strange happened. The Sega Mega Drive, finally getting its turn in the Turtles spotlight, received a completely different game. One that looked like Turtles in Time, it sounded like Turtles in Time, but what players got was something altogether different. At this point in time, both Konami and Capcom had exclusivity deals with Nintendo, a business arrangement that would keep their biggest arcade juggernauts, such as Turtles in Time and the original Street Fighter II, firmly chained to the Super Nintendo. This meant that if Sega fans wanted a taste of the action, publishers had to get creative. So instead of simply porting Turtles in Time to the Mega Drive, which legally and technically wasn't on the cards, Konami did the next best thing. They made an entirely different game that just happened to look suspiciously similar. A clever workaround, if ever there was one. Besides, Turtles in Time's conversion on the SNES leaned heavily on Mode 7 effects, fancy graphical flourishes bespoke to Nintendo's hardware. The Mega Drive, on the other hand, wasn't built for such visual wizardry, so Konami decided to design something more tailored to Sega's strengths. But the end result, well, you boot it up and you'd be forgiven for thinking you were playing Turtles in Time anyway. From the get-go, it's deja vu central. The character select screen near identical, the intro cutscene practically a remix. Once again we see April O'Neil reporting live in front of a Statue of Liberty, but this time Shredder doesn't just steal the statue. Oh no, he shrinks the entire island of Manhattan, because why settle for petty theft when you can go full supervillain with a shrinking ray from Dimension X? This bombastic little setup gives the game its name, the Hyperstone Heist, and launches the Turtles on a mission to restore their hometown to its full glorious size. The first stage drops you straight into the sewer system, because of course it does. This is the Ninja Turtles after all. But again, if you've played Turtles in Time, you'll be doing double takes already. The sprites, the animations, the sound effects, it all feels just familiar enough to mess with your memory. And that, my friends, is where things start to get weird. As the first stage kicks off, it quickly becomes clear that while the Hyperstone Heist might look like Turtles in Time, it's far from a carbon copy. The level layouts are completely different. No time-travelling pirate ships or prehistoric dino stampedes here. But the sprite work? Oh, that's identical. The turtle animations, the foot soldier designs, even the goofy pratfalls and flailing punches, all lifted straight from the Super Nintendo game. It becomes apparent very quickly that Hyperstone Heist isn't so much a new experience as it is a reconstruction, built from the leftover bricks of Turtles in Time. Think of it as a remix album made using the same instruments, just played in a different order. Controls feel near identical too. Movement, attack speed, the way the pizzas drop to replenish health. It's all the same. And before long, the familiar wheeled robot enemies roll in, just as they did in the SNES game's opening stage. By the time you reach the second half of this level, things feel even more suspicious. The backgrounds in this section are virtually identical to those used in Stage 2 of the SNES version. The fire hydrant that spews water at passers-by, still here. But this time Konami added a twist. Now there are cars barreling through the streets that can run you over. New obstacles, same old chaos. Still, these borrowed assets and reused set pieces explain exactly why so many people walk away from Hyperstone Heist convinced they played Turtles in Time. It's not their fault Konami practically designed the confusion, and the illusion continues. The stage soon dips back underground into yet another sewer, this time wetter, muddier, and still crawling with colour-swapped foot soldiers. And if you've got sharp eyes, you'll spot yet another recycled foe. That alien-looking menace from the surfing stage in the arcade game makes its reappearance here, now just awkwardly plopped into a tunnel like someone forgot which folder they were dragging enemies out of. The boss of the opening stage is none other than Leatherhead, yet another familiar face recycled straight from Turtles in Time. Originally appearing in the Western-themed train level, yes, the one where time-travelling turtles battled on a moving locomotive, Leatherhead returns here without a hint of explanation. No train, no cowboy hat, just vibes. After that showdown, the game takes a sudden turn seaward, into a stage called the Mysterious Ghost Ship. Here the turtles inexplicably hop onto surfboards and begin gliding across open waters. While the setting is technically new, the surfing mechanic itself is once again borrowed directly from the earlier game. Then again, it's not plagiarism if you're stealing from yourself, right? On the surf, players are pestered by robotic flying enemies that, to Konami's credit, do appear to be new. They're certainly not recognisable from anything in Turtles or Time, or TIT, as we'll now refer to it for sheer comedic and convenience purposes moving forward. Once the turtles clamber aboard the titular ghost ship, the level does finally start to show a bit of unique personality. The interior is grim and gothic, with a frankly hilarious painting of Shredder hanging ominously on the wall like he's auditioning for Ghostwatch. The sky visible through the battered hull is a sickly shade of purple, and the whole place gives off major discount Castlevania boat level energy. Barrels roll towards you because of course they do. It's not a beat 'em up unless something round is trying to flatten you, and while foot soldiers return in bulk, the developers also drop in a few more familiar foes from TIT to keep nostalgia on standby. Eventually the turtles make it ashore, diving straight into a cavern level where the hazards go from slightly nautical to mildly lethal. Falling stalactites, precariously placed dynamite, and yet more pallet-swapped enemies try to halt your progress. But it all culminates in a boss fight with Rocksteady, now fighting solo without Bebop by his side. He's at least changed his clothes, which is more than most 90s action figures could say, but in terms of challenge, not exactly what I'd call a rhinoceros stampede. Still, the game rolls on, and so do the questions. Is this a bold reimagining, a half-hearted port, or the video game equivalent of Deja Vu? Let's keep going. Stage 3, or Scene 3 as the game rather grandiosely calls it, sees the turtles leaving the dank caverns behind, and apparently making their way towards Shredder's hideout. Along the way, players will encounter another barrage of familiar enemies as they pass a large, very Eastern-looking building. Eastern-orientated, you might say. The Orient, if you will. See what I did there? You're welcome. Inside, things take a dramatic tonal shift. Suddenly, you're dodging traps, leaping over spike pits and navigating mechanical contraptions, and just like that, it feels less like a Turtles game and more like a lost level from Gambari Goemon, or Mystical Ninja to some of you. Which, funnily enough, was also developed by Konami. Coincidence, or just more asset swapping shenanigans from a dev team on a deadline? And while many of the traps feel comically old-fashioned, swinging blades, rolling logs and collapsing floors, there's also the occasional laser beam, because why not? Historical accuracy is for nerds. The boss of this stage is Tatsu, a fully original addition to the roster and the first human enemy we've fought so far. He's tough too, lobbing projectiles while a constant wave of foot soldiers try to reduce you to turtle soup. A decent challenge if nothing else. Then comes Scene 4, dramatically titled The Gauntlet. And unfortunately, it lives up to its name. Not because it's hard, but because it's a gauntlet of recycled content. We're back in yet another cave, how thrilling, but this time the floor is coated in water, so the game can justify reusing those alien-like swimming enemies from earlier. Things quickly get lazier. First, you fight a pallet-swapped Leatherhead, then a pallet-swapped Rocksteady, then you guessed it, a pallet-swapped Tatsu. 3 bosses you've already defeated, now colour-coded for your inconvenience. This isn't a boss rush, it's a padding parade. But at long last, a real boss arrives. An airborne version of Baxter Stockman, flying around like a wasp at a picnic, hurling out endless robotic minions. He's annoying, sure, but at least he's new, and at this point, that's all we can really ask for. Defeat him and you're rewarded with a glimpse of a Technodrome, our next destination, and the final level of the game. The Technodrome stage is a hodgepodge of recycled elements from the SNES version, but halfway through we get another returning boss, Krang, in his giant mech suit, just as he appeared in TIT. Because if you're going to steal, you might as well steal from the best. Then it's elevator time, because as we all know, no beat 'em up is complete without a long, awkward elevator sequence where the game throws everything it's got at you in a desperate bid to drain your last few lives. At the bottom of this shaft, both literally and metaphorically, lies the final boss, Super Shredder, because of course it's Super Shredder, just like in the Super Nintendo version of TIT. After a fairly intense showdown, defeating him restores Manhattan to its proper size, setting the world right and cueing the end credits. Order is restored, the universe is saved, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are once again free to do what they do best: eat pizza and shout cowabunga at inappropriate volumes. So that was a full breakdown of every stage and key moment in the Hyperstone Heist. And now that we've taken the plunge into this curious Mega Drive title, it's time to ask the all-important question: how does it stack up next to Turtles in Time? Which is truly the better game? Well, let's be honest, the Hyperstone Heist is shameless. So many of its assets, animations, enemy types and sound effects are directly recycled from TIT. It borders on daylight robbery. At times it feels like Konami slapped together a Frankenstein's monster of the game under the assumption that no child in 1992 could afford both a SNES and a Mega Drive. So who would ever notice? And to some degree, they were probably right. But that's also why so many people to this day confuse the two titles. Some think they're ports of the same game. Others, even more tragically, believe Hyperstone Heist is some kind of butchered Mega Drive version of the arcade original. Yet when you look past the recycled bits, when you take the time to actually analyse what's new, Hyperstone Heist holds its own. It has mostly original levels, a different storyline, and a handful of unique bosses. It is undeniably a different game. Now, is it better? That's where things get tricky. Many fans write it off entirely due to the amount of reused content, and if you've played the arcade version of Turtles in Time or its SNES port, that's understandable. But viewed in isolation without the looming shadow of Tit hanging over it, the Hyperstone Heist is a genuinely solid beat 'em up. In fact, aside from the Streets of Rage trilogy, it's arguably one of the best examples of the genre on the Mega Drive. It's fast, responsive, visually appealing, and just plain fun. That said, it's hard to elevate it to the same pedestal as Turtles in Time for one simple reason: scope. The SNES game feels bigger, it has more stages, greater variety, and the wild time travel premise gives it a charm and spectacle that Hyperstone Heist never quite matches. One sends you leaping through history, the other has you fighting in another cave. Again. It's amusing that for a game about shrinking Manhattan, the Hyperstone Heist does end up feeling like a smaller, less epic experience overall. A bite-sized version of something grander, a compact cousin to Turtles in Time if you will. Still, despite its trimmed-down feel, the game isn't without value. The number of entirely new stages and original boss fights ensure that the Hyperstone Heist is more than just a lazy retread. It's a game absolutely worth playing, whether you've already completed Turtles in Time a dozen times or not. No, it's not the best in the series, but it is an essential curiosity, a fascinating example of how the same developer in the same era could create two different interpretations of the same franchise, simply based on which console they were working with. A bold, creative strategy that made the 16-bit era so uniquely brilliant. Turtles Tournament Fighters, what jolly good fun. When one thinks of Street Fighter 2 clones, a few usual suspects spring to mind. But Konami, they weren't content with merely cloning Capcom's cash cow. No, they had to go and make 3 entirely different fighting games all under the same name. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter is perhaps the most confusing case of identity theft in gaming history. Released across the NES, Super Nintendo and Mega Drive, all within the same window, these were not ports. They were not enhanced editions, they were 3 wildly different beasts, each masquerading under the same box art and branding. As if nobody at Konami thought anyone would notice. The end result, a Frankensteinian trio of games that differ vastly in quality. Beat-em-ups, once the perfect match for the Turtles' martial arts chaos, were slowly beginning to fade in popularity. In their place, a new champion was rising, the competitive strategic versus fighting game. Thanks to the breakthrough success of Street Fighter 2, fighting games were quickly becoming the new gold standard. And like everyone else, Konami took notice and decided to throw the Turtles into the ring. Turtles Tournament Fighters wasn't just a game, it was a project. A cross-platform experiment that tried to merge what was left of the Turtles' fading popularity with the red-hot energy of the early 90s fighting game boom. Konami clearly looked at the equation, Turtles plus Street Fighter equals guaranteed success, and thought, why wouldn't this work? 2 plus 2 equals 5, right? Well, sort of. What set Tournament Fighters apart wasn't just that it was the first Turtles game in the versus fighting genre, it was that Konami leaned into the full weight of a Turtles multiverse. By 1993, this wasn't just one franchise. You had the animated cartoon, you had the movie trilogy, you had the original Mirage comic books, and the child-friendly Archie comics adaptation, both of which were publishing simultaneously with their own characters, timelines, and tone. Each of these Turtleverses had its own lore, its own visual identity, and even unique characters that had never crossed into the others. And Tournament Fighters took full advantage of this. Instead of drawing from just one source, Konami created a mixed universe roster, mashing together fighters from across the various Turtles canons. So whether you were only familiar with the cartoon, or exclusively read the comics, or were just in it for the pizza, there was always someone new to discover. In fact, it may have even nudged curious players to explore the corners of the franchise they hadn't yet touched, turning comic readers into gamers and gamers into comic readers. Clever cross-promotion that. But here's the crazy part. Despite sharing the same name and launching around the same time, the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions of Tournament Fighters are entirely different games. They've got different rosters, different mechanics, different design philosophies. It's like Konami split into parallel dimensions to develop them, and today we're crossing over to compare them. Let's begin with the Super Nintendo version. Like most fighting games of the era, the story is wafer thin. There's a tournament, there are fighters, and someone's getting kicked in the shell. But hey, it's right there in the name, Tournament Fighters. You knew what you were signing up for. When you power on the Super Nintendo version of Tournament Fighters, you're greeted with a surprisingly cinematic intro. The Turtles are sat around watching TV coverage of an upcoming fighting tournament, and shockingly, their arch-nemesis Shredder has just been announced he's entering. Naturally, the boys in green decide they can't let that stand, but rather than team up as usual, they agree to enter individually, each determined to win the tournament in their own right. And here's the neat twist, they all agree that if they end up fighting each other, it's nothing personal, it's just business, or in this case, just tournament rules. It's a small touch but a smart one. Once you jump into the action, players can choose from a roster of 10 unique fighters, which we'll break down in more detail shortly. Before your first match begins, you're treated to another brief cutscene featuring April O'Neil as the tournament's host, announcing that the winner will walk away with more money than they could possibly imagine. Apparently, being a ninja mutant just doesn't pay the bills. Story and character breakdowns are coming up, but first, let's talk about how this game actually plays. Like Street Fighter 2 before it, Tournament Fighters on the Super Nintendo uses the familiar 2 out of 3 rounds format. The controls take full advantage of the Super Nintendo's button layout, offering a 4-button setup: weak punch, weak kick, strong kick. It's a simple, satisfying control scheme that fans of the genre will feel instantly at home with, but there's more to it than just mashing buttons. One of the game's standout mechanics is the mutagen meter, a green bar that fills as you land hits on your opponent. Once it's full, you can unleash a devastating super special move. No fiddly combos required, just press both strong attack buttons at the same time and let the fireworks fly. This system strikes a great balance between accessibility and depth. It gives new players an easy way to pull off powerful moves while still rewarding aggressive, well-timed play. It's intuitive, it's satisfying, and it makes for some brilliant comeback moments. Exactly what you want in a classic 16-bit fighter. One thing that not every fighting game manages to get right is player control over experience. Yes, I'm looking squarely at you, Street Fighter 3, a brilliant game mechanically, but one that left many newcomers in the dust. In contrast, Tournament Fighters offers a rather thoughtful option, the ability to adjust the game speed. This gives players the freedom to tailor the pace to their liking. Whether you're a button-mashing beginner or a seasoned fighting game veteran, there's a setting that suits your style. Each fighter comes equipped with a unique moveset, adding flavour and variety to the experience. While the basic attack range and general feel are fairly consistent across the board, meaning no character feels wildly out of step, the special moves are where the diversity shines. Each fighter has at least 1 or 2 tricks that make them stand out, giving the game just enough tactical variety to keep things interesting. And let's not forget the stages. Each arena features its own distinct backdrop, packed with detail and personality, helping to establish a strong sense of atmosphere. Whether it's a rooftop, a lab, or a techno wasteland, every fight feels like it's happening somewhere, just not in a blank void like some lesser fighters of the time. All in all, the Super Nintendo version of Tournament Fighters is a solid little fighting game. So with that groundwork covered, let's take a look at the lineup of playable characters. Of the 10 available fighters, 4 are of course the Turtles themselves: Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael and Michelangelo, and chances are you already know more about them than you'd care to admit. So instead, let's shift our focus to the other 6 fighters who round out the roster. Wingnut is up first, a bat-like humanoid alien who originally appeared in the Archie comics series and even made a one-off appearance in the 1987 cartoon. He's a deep-cut pick, but fans of the expanded Turtles universe will appreciate the nod. Next is Cyber Shredder, who marks the first time Shredder was playable in a Turtles game. Interestingly, his design here is based more on his Mirage Comics appearance than the cartoon version most will be familiar with. The name Cyber Shredder was actually first used in the Game Boy title Radical Rescue, where Shredder became a fully cybernetic menace, though in Tournament Fighters there is no in-game explanation suggesting this is the same version. He's just shiny and menacing. Then we've got Chrome Dome, a towering android who was originally created for the animated TV series. His cold, robotic demeanour contrasts nicely with the more expressive fighters in the roster, and his design fits right in with the futuristic tone of many of the game's stages. Next up is Armagon, a mutant shark from the future who appears front and centre on the game's box art. Like Wingnut, Armagon hails from the Archie comics continuity. With his razor-sharp teeth, cybernetic armour and teleporting shark powers, yes really, he's easily one of the most memorable original fighters in the game. Then there's War, a hulking purple brute with claws like meat cleavers. He's another deep cut from the Archie universe, known as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. In other words, this isn't just some big lad for the sake of it. He's lore-rich, terrifying, and a proper tank to play as. And finally, we get to perhaps the most mysterious fighter of the entire roster, Asuka. While every other fighter in the game was lifted from existing Turtles media, Asuka made her debut in this game. She didn't come from the comics, the cartoon, or the films. She was a brand new addition. This naturally led to plenty of speculation over the years. Some believe she was included to appeal more to Japanese players, especially since her sprite in the Japanese version shows off significantly more cheek than the Western release. But in 2010, things got more interesting. A beta version of the game surfaced online, and in it, Asuka didn't exist. Instead, a different version of a character was buried in the game's code, under the name Mitsu. And that name should sound familiar, because Mitsu was a major character in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, the third live-action film. The theory goes that Konami originally intended to include Mitsu in the game, but quietly renamed and redesigned her as Asuka to distance themselves from the critically panned film. Now, outside of the 10 base characters on the select screen, there are a few more worth mentioning. One is Fake Brother, a shadowy clone of whichever turtle you've chosen. He's essentially a mirror match of a purple palette swap, and while not especially deep, it's a cool touch that adds a sense of rivalry to the story mode. Then we have the 2 boss characters. The first is the Rat King, a deranged lunatic who has cast off his humanity and believes himself to be quite literally a rat. He's not mutated with this version of the character, but he's clearly unhinged, armed with range attacks and rat-based mayhem that make him a unique challenge. The Rat King is one of the few characters who managed to cross over into just about every corner of the Turtles universe. He appeared in both the original comic book series and the animated cartoon, and even made his way into multiple video games. In Tournament Fighters, he serves as one of the boss characters, and his deranged personality and rat-obsessed attacks make him a uniquely creepy adversary. But the final showdown in the Super Nintendo version, that's reserved for none other than Karai. Now, Karai's portrayal has always varied depending on which version of Turtles lore you're looking at. In some adaptations, she's presented as Shredder's adopted daughter, or even his biological granddaughter. But in her original Mirage Comics incarnation, she wasn't related to Shredder at all. In fact, she outranked him, a high-ranking Foot Clan commander with global authority. That detail adds weight to her appearance here as the game's ultimate boss. In the Super Nintendo game story mode, Karai kidnaps both Splinter and April O'Neil in a bid to avenge Shredder. Once defeated, she's treated to a character-specific ending, a tradition that's still alive and well in fighting games to this day. At launch, Tournament Fighters on the Super Nintendo received glowing reviews from the press. Critics praised its accessible mechanics, colourful visuals and deep roster. GamePro famously gave the game a perfect score, stating, "You want Street Fighter action with Street Fighter 2? Here's a serious Street Buster clone that can bring street snobs as well as fledgling fighters out of their shell." Meanwhile, Nintendo Magazine UK dismissed the idea that the Turtles were yesterday's news, writing, "Who said Turtles are old hat? The half-shelled ones deserve respect for being hottest contenders for Game of the Year." And gameplay has summed it up perfectly. For Turtles who've grown up but still want a good brawl, the Super Nintendo version gives you 10 fighters to the Genesis' 8. And the graphics are much better too. There's one clear winner, even before the fighting starts. So that's the Super Nintendo version, a solid, well-reviewed fighter that brought together characters from across the Turtles multiverse and delivered a competent alternative to Street Fighter 2. But remember, this was only 1/3 of the story, because the exact same day, Konami released another game under the Tournament Fighters name, this time for the Sega Mega Drive. And just to keep things confusing, the box art prominently featured a Triceraton, a character who wasn't even in the Super Nintendo version. When I said these were completely different games, I wasn't being dramatic. I was being literal. And the Mega Drive version of Tournament Fighters wasted no time proving that. Right from the intro, you're met with a totally different storyline. This time we open on a group of mysterious full purple turtle doppelgangers, very much like the fake brother from the Super Nintendo game, who have kidnapped Splinter on behalf of none other than Krang. In this version of the story, the 4 turtles team up with a new cast of allies and travel across the galaxy in search of their missing master. As in the Super Nintendo release, Karai still serves as the final boss, but here the plot twist reveals she was secretly the mastermind behind Splinter's abduction all along. But the differences don't stop at the story. The gameplay has been completely reworked to suit the Mega Drive's 3-button controller. 1 button for punch, 1 for kick, and 1 for taunt. Yes, taunt. But it's not just for show. When combined with specific directional inputs, the taunt button lets players execute desperation attacks when their health is low, a mechanic clearly inspired by SNK's recent fighting games of the time. Stronger punches and kicks can also be triggered by holding the D-pad towards your opponent during attacks, adding a layer of nuance to each exchange. Notably, the special move meter from the Super Nintendo version is completely gone, changing the flow and strategy of battles. Instead of waiting to fill a bar, your best attacks now hinge on risk and how close to death you're willing to get. As for the roster, aside from the purple doppelgangers, this version also features 10 fighters in total. That includes the 4 Turtles and Karai again, but everyone else is exclusive to this version. So let's go through a few of them. First up is Casey Jones, the hockey-masked, sports-obsessed vigilante known for being both Raphael's chaotic best friend and April O'Neil's occasional love interest. He's a fan favourite, and it's great to finally see him playable in a proper fighting game. Then there's Triceraton, a member of the alien Triceraton Empire, resembling a bipedal Triceratops and frequently depicted as a recurring villain across multiple Turtles timelines. He was even on the Mega Drive box art, which is especially funny given he doesn't appear at all in the Super Nintendo version. And last but definitely not least, Krang himself, the disembodied brain with a grudge and a battle mech to match. He's a household name for Turtles fans and makes a welcome appearance here as a playable fighter, finally stepping into the spotlight rather than just barking orders from a giant robot stomach. The Mega Drive version of Tournament Fighters also introduces 2 utterly bizarre characters that appear to be exclusive to this release, and both are framed as allies of the Turtles. First up is Ray Fillet, a humanoid manta ray who looks like he swam in straight from the Archie comics. Then there's Sisypheus, a giant mutant beetle with a name better suited to Greek mythology than a Saturday morning cartoon. Still, they're both playable and unique, giving this version of the game even more roster variety, whether it makes any sense or not. And then out of nowhere, we get April O'Neil as a playable character. But not just any April. This version of April is hilariously dressed in what is very clearly a Blaze Fielding cosplay from Streets of Rage. It's glorious, unsubtle, and honestly, a perfect nod for the Sega crowd. Beyond the roster, the Mega Drive version also features a completely bonkers tournament mode, where you're tasked with defeating multiple opponents in a row using just one life bar. It's absolute madness, but it adds a strange arcade-like challenge for those looking to punish themselves. So let's be clear, different story, different roster, different combat system, even different tone. The Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions of Tournament Fighters are absolutely not the same game. In fact, they feel more like competing interpretations of the same idea made by teams that weren't allowed to share notes. Visually, the Mega Drive version doesn't quite hold up against its Nintendo counterpart. Personally, I think the Super Nintendo version is in a completely different league. But what did the critics of the time think? Well, they didn't mince their words. Meme Machines noted that while the game offered fast fighting action and a new game direction for the terrible Terrapins, it couldn't even begin to approach the greatness of Street Fighter II. They also pointed out several gameplay flaws that held it back. Power Unlimited, which sounds more like a Sith Lords magazine, bluntly claimed the Sega version was dramatically worse than the Super Nintendo release, citing grainy graphics and stiff controls as major drawbacks. Electronic Gaming Monthly joined the pylon, stating, "Oh no, what happened in this one? The Super NES version was excellent. This one isn't even close. There aren't many moves and the fighters are unappealing. The game also has a darker look and feel." In short, the Mega Drive version definitely did what Nintendo didn't, and that was serve up the weaker game. But Konami wasn't done just yet. There was one more version of Tournament Fighters, and this one might be the strangest of them all. In 1994, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters made its final appearance, this time on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Skipping Japan entirely, this 8-bit swan song was released only in the West, and holds the unique honour of being the last officially licensed NES game ever released in PAL regions. And yes, it's a completely different game again, so let's take a look. The storyline here is far more rudimentary. There's no intergalactic kidnapping, no Karai masterminding anything. It's simply Shredder issuing a challenge to the Turtles, forcing them to fight each other and their allies to determine who's worthy enough to face him. That's it, no bells, no whistles, just fists, shells and honour. Still, despite its simplicity, the game holds a unique appeal. Tournament Fighters is one of the very few fighting games ever released on the NES, which makes sense considering the genre didn't really explode until the 16-bit era. By the time that title launched in '94, the NES was practically on life support, especially in the West. This was the final licensed NES game ever released in PAL territories, as I said, making it a genuine collector's oddity. The character roster is trimmed down accordingly. There were 7 fighters, the 4 Turtles, Shredder, Casey Jones, and one exclusive edition, Hothead. Hothead comes from the comics, and his backstory is wild. He's the result of a former firefighter accidentally unleashing the spirit of an ancient samurai dragon, who then possesses him. Yes, that's how you spice up your roster when the NES can't handle Krang's bouncy brain mech. Visually, it's about what you'd expect from a late-era NES title. There's chunky, blocky sprites reminiscent of Konami's earlier beat-em-ups on the system. The controls are even simpler this time around, owing to the NES's 2-button layout. Punch and kick, rinse and repeat, and just to set expectations, the 4 turtles are basically palette sorts of each other. But even with limited controls, Konami managed to sneak in a super move system. How? By getting creative. During matches, Splinter's face will sometimes appear on a floating monitor in the background and drop a glowing red ball in the centre of the stage. If either player grabs it, they'll be able to perform their super move by inputting a specific command. It's clunky, it's weird, and it kind of feels like picking up a bonus in Bomberman, but it works in a scrappy sort of way. Critics at the time had mixed feelings about the NES version. Some gave it a bit of leeway due to the limitations of the hardware, but it wasn't exactly showered in praise. GamePro sums it up nicely. Konami's last dip into the sewers of Manhattan produces a workable NES fight, but it comes up a tad murky. Yanking the turtles' weapons definitely makes them lose some bite. Either you've got to love them turtles, or you must really need an NES fighter to get into this cart. And that about says it all. 3 consoles, 3 different games, same title, a unified brand, held together with pizza, grease, and sheer force of will. Even Electronic Gaming Monthly had to admit that while pulling off special moves with just 2 buttons was a clever workaround, the NES version suffered from heavy flicker and visual breakup during matches. Megaload echoed the sentiment, concluding, all in all, Konami could certainly have done the conversions better, and have done better, as they already demonstrated with the NES version of Bucky O'Hare. Still, they conceded that the game offered a bit of moody fighting fun. But with the release of these Tournament Fighters titles, we were witnessing the end of an era, the final hurrah of a classic Turtles boom. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the Turtles have been the dominant force in children's entertainment, merchandising juggernauts, video game icons and heroes in a half shell to an entire generation. But by 1993, the landscape was shifting. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers had arrived in a flurry of pyrotechnics, spandex and Zords, quickly dethroning the Turtles and taking over as the new global pop culture phenomenon. From TV ratings to toy aisles, the Power Rangers dominated, leaving the Turtles to retreat into cult status. I personally don't think any of the Tournament Fighters games sold as well as Konami had hoped. Not only was the Turtles an aging franchise by that point, but the fighting game genre itself was becoming oversaturated. Had these games released just 2 years earlier, at the height of both Turtles Mania and the early Street Fighter II craze, they likely would have been far more successful. Even so, the Super Nintendo version in particular served as a respectable send-off for the Turtles in the 16-bit days, and it's still fondly remembered by fans now. In fact, you could argue that its simple, intuitive mechanics were a precursor to the more accessible fighting game designs we'd start seeing in the 2000s. Each of the 3 Tournament Fighters brings something different to the table. They're wildly inconsistent, yes, and not without their flaws, but they all have one thing in common: they're remembered. For many 90s kids, they weren't just fighting games. They were after-school rituals, rainy day staples, birthday presents from a clueless aunt that turned out to be amazing. So based on those reasons, they deserve respect for that, at least. But despite all of that, there are still a few more gems from that golden period worth exploring. One that ditched the difficulty spikes and arcade compromises, and instead delivered a short, sweet, and surprisingly solid portable adventure. The Game Boy games were simply amazing. The first of this bunch was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan, a game that was radically different from its contemporaries and arguably better than anything else you could play at home at the time. Sure, it may look like a simple, monochrome platformer, and yes, in many ways it is, but Konami got just about everything right with this one, and considering it was their first ever Game Boy Turtles title, released only a year after the Game Boy itself launched, it's even more impressive. So let's dig into its history. Having started life as gritty comic book characters in 1987, the Turtles had recently exploded into video games too. By 1989, 2 major titles had launched. First, Konami's iconic 4-player arcade beat-em-up, and second, a brutally difficult side-scroller for the NES and various home computers. That NES game is of course historically divisive, and back then, while plenty of kids tried to love it, it was often considered to be too hard, too clunky, and too disconnected from the cartoon that children knew and loved. And don't even mention the tricky dam level. Put simply, a lot of kids didn't want obscure mazes and pixel-perfect jumps, they wanted the arcade game, or at the very least something that actually looked and felt like the show. In 1990, their prayers were answered, sort of. Konami ported the arcade hit to the NES as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 the arcade game, but it came with heavy compromises. 4-player co-op was dropped to 2, sprites and animations were scaled back. And while it was still fun, it felt more like a shadow of the real thing, and the less said about the home computer versions, the better. In hindsight, it's a crying shame the game never made it to the Sega Mega Drive. Had Sega secured the Turtles license back then, they might have had a killer pack-in title on their hands, one that could have helped define the 16-bit era before Sonic ever rolled onto the scene, but alas, that situation was never to be. So, as things stood in 1990, Turtles fans at home had 2 NES games, one punishing and clunky, the other a compromised port. But in the background, something else was brewing, on a brand new device nonetheless. A system that would quietly deliver the most approachable, playable Turtles game of the lot. That platform, of course, was the Game Boy. Launched in 1989, Nintendo's first handheld console was already off to a strong start. It was affordable, pocket-sized, and came bundled with Tetris, an instant killer app. Combined with Nintendo's brand trust, the Game Boy was flying off shelves, and among the millions of kids begging their parents for one, you can bet a huge chunk were Turtles fans. So when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan landed on the 3rd of August 1990 in Japan and North America, followed by a censored Hero Turtles version in Europe the following year, it couldn't have arrived at a better time. From the moment you powered it on, Fall of the Foot Clan felt different, and that was a very good thing. The title was a massive breath of fresh air, and wisely, instead of foolishly trying to replicate the arcade beat-em-up formula, they delivered a side-scrolling platformer, a design choice that made far more sense given the Game Boy's modest hardware. At the time, the golden age of traditional platformers was still in full swing, with Super Mario Bros. And co. sitting proudly atop the pyramid. So a decent Turtles one was a welcome addition to the Game Boy's growing library. Fall of the Foot Clan kicks off with a classic premise. April O'Neil has been kidnapped by Shredder. Krang and the Foot Clan is up to Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Rembrandt to rescue her, a story as familiar as it is effective. The journey takes players through the sewers, across the streets of New York, and into various enemy hideouts, battling an onslaught of foot soldiers along the way, and crucially, this time Konami absolutely nailed the difficulty curve. Where the NES platformer was notorious for being overly punishing and labyrinthian, Fall of the Foot Clan offered something far more approachable, a game that kids could actually finish, and more importantly, enjoy doing so. The controls were simple, the levels were short but satisfying, and the entire experience was optimised for short play sessions, perfect for bus rides, break times, or those under-the-cover midnight missions with a torch. On top of featuring digestible gameplay, visually the game deserves a lot more praise than it typically gets. Most early Game Boy titles, including Nintendo's own Super Mario Land, featured tiny, hard-to-see sprites that barely held up on the system's blurry, unlit screen. But Konami, on the other hand, understood the assignment from day one and utilised the most sensible strategy to optimise a Game Boy experience. This meant that Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan used large, bold sprites that popped off the screen. The turtles were instantly recognisable, enemies were distinct, and everything was legible, even under the dodgy lighting conditions of the time. In fact, it would take Nintendo another 2 years to match that level of clarity with Super Mario Land 2 6 golden coins. Konami, however, seemed to get it right the first try. Across its 5 stages, Fall of the Foot Clan delivers a smooth, no-nonsense platforming experience, one that perfectly suits the Game Boy's stop-start playstyle. Whether you were riding in the backseat waiting for dinner or trying to sneak in a few extra lives before bed, this was a game that never overstayed its welcome. You begin by slashing your way through the streets of New York, accompanied by a crunchy chiptune rendition of the classic Turtles theme. This soundtrack was composed by none other than Michiru Yamane, who would later rise to legendary status for her work on Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But even here, on humble Game Boy hardware in 1990, you can already hear the hallmarks of her style. Each stage has a distinct mood and tempo, matching the pixelated grime of New York's underbelly perfectly. As for the controls, they're about as elegant as the Game Boy could get. You can attack while standing, crouching, or jumping. You can do jump kicks, you can throw shurikens while ducking, and if that wasn't enough, the game even lets you remap the jump and attack buttons, a surprisingly forward-thinking feature for a handheld title, or any title for that matter back then. Combat is simple, methodical, and satisfying. It's not going to win awards for complexity, but it doesn't need to. This is portable action done right, and the whole experience carries that deliberate, weighty feel you might associate with early Castlevania games. Fall of the Foot Clan was designed by Naoki Matsui, a former MSX developer who had previously worked on titles like Vampire Killer and Gradius. After Konami stopped supporting the MSX, his team transitioned to Game Boy development, and this was their first major project in that new era. In other words, the team behind Fall of the Foot Clan didn't just understand 8-bit gaming with limitations, they helped define what was possible with it. After Konami shifted away from MSX support, Matsui's team was repositioned to focus on Game Boy development, and Fall of the Foot Clan was their first major outing under that new mandate. This wasn't just a case of throwing together a cheap tie-in. Konami poured real talent into this project, and it shows. Each of the game's 5 stages concludes with a boss battle lifted straight from a cartoon. First up is Rocksteady, who peppers you with bullets while you try to get in close to land a few hits. Beat him, and you're rewarded with a simple yet effective cutscene that moves the plot forward and keeps things anchored in the familiar Turtles universe, a surprisingly polished touch for an early Game Boy game. Stage 2 takes place in a factory. Here, players dodge rolling barrels and machinery while facing waves of foot soldiers and mechanical enemies. The boss, Bebop, equipped with a laser gun and a nasty headbutt. Nothing revolutionary, but it works. Stage 3, however, is where things really start to shine. This one takes place on the rooftops above moving traffic, with a parallax-style scrolling background that creates the illusion of momentum, a rare technical flourish for such limited hardware. The stage ends with a boss fight against Baxter Stockman in his insectoid flying form. He swoops and dives with unpredictable timing, demanding more precision than previous bosses. Stage 4 sees the turtles descend into a cavern level, and while IGN might say 6 out of 10, too much water, the water here is purely decorative. You can actually walk along the riverbed, slicing through fish and foot soldiers alike without any platforming punishment. It's moody, atmospheric, and features one of the game's best pieces of music. Eventually, you reach the penultimate showdown, a boss fight against Shredder himself. He's not quite as tough as he is in some of the NES games, but the fight is well animated and satisfying. Once he's down, it's time for the final gauntlet. The last stage takes place inside the Technodrome, and it's everything a Turtles fan could want. Conveyor belts, trapdoors, laser grids, relentless waves of foot soldiers, and yes, one final boss. This time it's Krang, stomping in all his megalomaniacal glory. He was completely absent from the NES game, so his inclusion here is a huge win for fans. Once he's beaten, April is rescued, and the Technodrome explodes into rubble. The game ends with a gloriously cheesy text scroll that ominously declares Shredder and Krang's whereabouts as being unknown. Better sleep with one eye open, dudes. At the time of release, Fall of the Foot Clan was praised by critics for being accessible, authentic and fun. Nintendo Power, GamePro and other contemporary publications gave it favourable reviews, calling it one of the better licensed games on the platform. Today, Fall of the Foot Clan stands as a textbook case of how to design around your platform strengths and your audience's expectations. Where the NES title often felt punishing and confusing, Fall of the Foot Clan delivered clarity, tight pacing, and just enough challenge to keep things engaging without becoming frustrating. And when you look at the credits, it's no mystery why. With Yamani's soundtrack, Matsui's design sensibilities, and a lean but talented programming team, this wasn't just another lazy licensed game. It was a Konami project through and through, back when that name still meant something. Konami could have phoned it in. Instead, they made something genuinely good, but of course, this was only the beginning. 2 more Turtles Game Boy games would follow, so let's move on to the next one. To set the scene, let's move on to the tubular year of 1991. but Turtles' popularity was still firing on all cylinders. New episodes of the animated series were airing weekly, and the second live-action film, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, had just hit cinemas worldwide. That same year saw a veritable flood of Turtles video games. Turtles in Time was lighting up arcades and melting faces with its brilliant 4-player beat-em-up action. The NES got the exclusive Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project, a worthy, if slightly underappreciated, 2-player side-scroller. There was even a DOS-only title called Manhattan Missions, a gritty oddity that hardly ever gets a mention. But for now, we're zeroing in on one of the other lesser talked about titles from that banner year, the second Game Boy installment. Released on the 15th of November 1991 in Japan, December 1991 in North America, and May 1992 in Europe under the Hero Turtles banner, Back from the Sewers may not have had the same name recognition as Turtles in Time, but make no mistake, this was no lazy sequel either. It was bigger, better looking, and far more ambitious than its predecessor. And for many kids who didn't have access to a home console, this was their definitive Turtles experience. At this point, Nintendo's 8-bit monochrome handheld had only been on the market for around 2 years, but it had already carved out a colossal audience thanks to its low price, long battery life and killer launch lineup. Back from the Sewers managed to improve on its predecessor in almost every respect. It featured more detailed sprite work, smoother animation, and better overall presentation, which was insanely all achieved by a completely different development team from the one behind the original. This time the project was led by Hiroyuki Fukui, a seasoned Konami veteran who had worked on Metal Gear from 1987, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and SD Snatcher. He also contributed to Snatcher itself, the beloved cyberpunk visual novel from Hideo Kojima. That alone is a serious CV for a Game Boy title, but what's even more impressive is what each team managed to squeeze out of the hardware. The design and sprite work was handled by a tight in-house Konami team with experience on both the MSX and Famicom. And in the audio department, Konami brought in Yuko Kurahashi and Tsuyoshi Sekito, both of whom had previously composed music for SD Snatcher and Solid Snake. Their chiptune work here is punchy, energetic, and instantly memorable, but what really sets Back from the Sewers apart is how confident and complete the game feels. The game kicks off with an intro sequence that mimics the animated TV show's title screen, complete with scrolling cityscapes and a surprisingly punchy music sting. You're then taken to a player select screen where you can choose any of the 4 turtles, and while they all look fairly similar due to the Game Boy's monochrome display, they do play differently. Each has their own speed, reach and attack arc depending on their weapon, meaning your choice can subtly affect how the game flows. Act 1 opens in the sewers, ironically making the title Back to the Sewers feel more appropriate, but the action quickly shifts to the streets above. From the very first moments, it's clear that this is a step up from Fall of the Foot Clan in every direction. Sprites are bigger, better animated, and more expressive. Backgrounds are layered and dynamic. Foot soldiers now burst out from foreground shadows or leap in from the skyline, adding a cinematic sense of movement rarely seen on the Game Boy. One especially memorable moment comes early on, when a foot soldier sets off a bomb that blows a hole through the floor. It's a slick little animation and a sign that Konami were really going above and beyond for a handheld title. The tension soon ramps up thanks to a frantic, percussive soundtrack that perfectly matches the on-screen chaos. And that chaos hits a peak when Rocksteady bursts through a wall to make his entrance as the first boss. It's a moment lifted straight from the cartoon, complete with falling debris and foot soldiers chucking junk from the rooftops. Stage 2 changes things up by introducing a high-speed side-scrolling skateboard section, clearly inspired by the arcade games. It's an auto-scrolling level that lets you move freely around the screen while dodging obstacles and attacking incoming enemies. And remarkably, it runs incredibly smoothly for the Game Boy hardware. After ploughing through waves of foot soldiers and mechanical nuisances, players face off against Bebop in a more open arena-style boss fight. Unlike Rocksteady's pattern-heavy encounter, Bebop moves more freely and unpredictably, requiring actual dodging and timing, a welcome challenge that feels far more dynamic than anything in the first game. The game also features bonus stages where players can collect pizzas to replenish their health, a welcome breather between missions. These bonus rounds are only available if all 4 turtles are still active. Lose one, instead of a pizza party, you're thrown into a rescue stage. There you must defeat a boss, typically Rex 1, a robotic character from the cartoon, in order to reclaim your fallen comrade. It's also worth noting that each turtle plays differently. These differences may not seem drastic at first, but they subtly shape how each stage is approached, giving the game a level of replayability rarely seen in early handheld titles. Act 3 drops the turtles into a construction site, providing a refreshing change of scenery and gameplay pacing. Here, players must platform their way across precarious steel beams and partially completed structures, dodging falling buckets and taking out waves of enemies. A few new enemy types even make their debut here, adding a touch of variety to the combat loop. The stage also features a classic elevator brawl, a staple of beat-em-ups like Final Fight and Streets of Rage. As you slowly ascend, waves of foot soldiers drop in from above. It's a short sequence, but it breaks up the platforming and injects a cinematic sense of escalation. Eventually, the level opens up even further, allowing players to climb up and down scaffolding and half-built buildings. Compared to Fall of the Foot Clan, the sense of verticality here is a massive improvement, making the environment feel larger and more interactive, and a game more in line with the visual style of the animated series. At the end of this stage, players come face to face with Krang in his walking mech suit. It's a fun and faithful interpretation of the character, with his goofy yet menacing design rendered surprisingly well in chunky monochrome pixels. As for Act 4, it kicks off in a mysterious cavern, and the game decides to ramp up the drama. Think Raiders of the Lost Ark, but with mutant turtles and massive boulders that come barreling towards you as you sprint headlong into danger. Then, just when you've mastered the timing, the game flips the script and sends you downhill, forcing you to avoid the same hazards at high speed. The soundtrack ramps up accordingly as well. As you descend deeper into the cavern, new hazards are introduced. Geysers that erupt beneath your feet, crumbling platforms and mysterious holes in the cave walls that act as hidden portals to shortcuts or secret zones. Some of these lead to underground sewer passages, which blend seamlessly with the game's layered level design. Eventually, you confront the cause of the chaos, a massive drill tank, clearly linked to Shredder. After battling through another wave of enemies, Shredder himself appears, acting as the boss of this region. He's no pushover. Shredder uses both melee strikes and ranged attacks, forcing players to stay mobile and precise. But despite your victory, he escapes at the last second, teasing a bigger showdown still to come. Act 5 takes a sharp left turn, literally up into the sky. Rather than moving left to right, players now leap from one floating platform to another, ascending ever upward in a vertical gauntlet. It's a welcome change of pace and presents a different kind of challenge, especially on the Game Boy's limited screen real estate, where one missed jump can be fatal. At the top of this aerial climb is Baxter Stockman in his classic mutant fly form. He zips around erratically, peppering the screen with projectiles. The small arena and rapid movement requires twitch reflexes and careful positioning, but for fans of the cartoon, it's an iconic showdown that absolutely delivers. Following his defeat, the game transitions into a series of tight beat-em-up style gauntlet rooms. These encounters are simple but brutal. Enemies spawn in close quarters and force you to rely on every bit of muscle memory you've picked up. At the end of it all, the Turtles finally rescue April O'Neil, or at least that's what it looks like. But this game isn't done yet, not by a long shot. The final act kicks off with a fast-paced sewer surfing section. Players must dodge debris, floating obstacles, and environmental hazards as the Turtles speed through underground rapids on their trusty boards, a clear homage to the chaotic surf stages of Turtles in Time. It's also worth mentioning that Back from the Sewers did what few Game Boy games dared. It included digitized speech samples, most notably the iconic Cowabunga on the title screen and Pizza Time on the pause menu. These were massive technical feats for 1991, requiring clever memory compression and audio channel juggling just to squeeze them onto the cartridge. Eventually, players reach the hulking drill tank vehicle, the holdover from the previous act and now the gateway to the ultimate destination, the Technodrome. In Turtles lore, this place is their Bowser's Castle, their final fortress, a twisted metal maze filled with lasers, conveyor belts and every foot soldier variant you've ever fought. As a closing stage, the Technodrome delivers exactly what fans would expect, and then some. Every classic beat-em-up trope is here, mini-boss gauntlets, escalating traps, familiar enemy rematches, and even another elevator fight that harks back to arcade staples like Double Dragon and Final Fight once more. It's a final exam for everything the player has learned so far. Eventually though, players face off against Shredder one final time, this time in his supercharged form. He moves faster, hits harder, and fills the screen with projectile attacks that punish mistimed jumps or button mashing. It's a legitimate test of endurance, especially if you've lost a turtle or two along the way. But defeating Shredder isn't the end. That honour belongs to Krang, who rolls in with a massive exosuit for a last-ditch climactic showdown. It's a brutal finale, but take him down and you're treated to an epic cutscene. All in all, Back from the Sewers is a remarkably ambitious and technically impressive Game Boy title for 1991. It builds on everything Konami had already accomplished with Fall of the Foot Clan, then cranks the dial up across the board with bigger sprites, more detailed animations, tighter gameplay, varied stage design and a deeper combat system. This isn't just one of the best Turtles games on the handheld, it's one of the best Game Boy action games of the early 90s full stop. Whether you're a collector, a retro gaming nerd, or just a sucker for all things Ninja Turtles, this one absolutely belongs in your library. So grab that Cowabunga collection I plugged earlier. But of course, one more Game Boy entry remains, and it's the most experimental of a lot. An unexpected genre shift, a radically different structure, and a name that still gets overlooked to this day. So grab your nunchucks and hang tight, because next we're tackling Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue. Unlike its platforming predecessors, Radical Rescue boldly ditches linear level design in favour of Metroidvania structure, years before that term even existed. In fact, Konami delivered this exploratory, ability-gated gameplay 4 years before they redefined the genre with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So let's break down what makes this criminally underrated title so unique, how it fits into the evolving Konami playbook of the early 90s, and why its influence runs deeper than most people realise, especially in retrospect. By 1993, the Turtles brand wasn't quite the merchandising juggernaut it had once been. TV ratings were falling, action figure sales were slowing, and that third live-action movie, the one with the time-travelling spectres and samurai, certainly didn't help matters. For the first time in years, the Turtles brand felt a little tired. That said, the games were still holding strong. In the summer of 1992, Turtles in Time dropped on the Super Nintendo, a title many still consider to be the greatest Turtles game of all time. Meanwhile, Sega's Mega Drive got its own exclusive beat-em-up in the form of The Hyperstone Heist, which reused assets from Turtles in Time but remixed them with faster pacing and new level layouts. But while both of those games were excellent, the beat-em-up genre as a whole was beginning to lose steam. The arcade scene was now being dominated by fighting games thanks to the explosive success of Street Fighter II. The old side-scrolling brawler format was starting to feel a little dated, and Konami, never ones to be left behind, recognised the shift. This led to a shake-up in the Turtles' video game identity department. The first major sign of change came with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters, released in September 1993 for the Super Nintendo, a 1v1 fighting game clearly designed to ride the Street Fighter wave. Versions for the NES and Mega Drive would follow shortly after, each featuring unique rosters, graphics, and mechanics despite sharing the same name. But nestled between those more conventional genre pivots was something completely different. We got this. In November 1993, Konami released Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue, a handheld game that would quietly become one of the company's earliest examples of exploration-based design. No levels, no linear paths, no pick-your-turtle brawler setup. Instead, players were dropped into a sprawling, interconnected maze and told to figure it out. At the time, most players didn't know what to make of it, but looking back, it's clear that Radical Rescue was Konami's first serious step towards the Metroidvania genre, even if nobody was calling it that yet. As mentioned earlier, this wasn't just another rehash. Radical Rescue marked a total shift in gameplay philosophy. Where the Turtles' earlier video game appearances had clung tightly to beat-em-up conventions or side-scrolling platforming tropes, this title boldly ditched the formula in favour of something far less linear. Radical Rescue is radically different from its predecessors in the trilogy. There's no side-scrolling level progression, no one-off stages or limited turtle lives. Instead, we get a sprawling map, free-form navigation, and new areas gated behind character abilities. It's essentially a Ninja Turtles PS1 era onwards Castlevania game. Now, full disclosure, I've never been especially fond of the term Metroidvania. It's a cheesy portmanteau, and frankly, the kind of gameplay it describes predates both Metroid and Castlevania. If you go back far enough, you'll find games like Jet Set Fucking Willy or the ZX Spectrum doing much of the same thing. Maze-like exploration, collectible gating, and non-linear progression, all developed by a teenager in his bedroom long before big Japanese studios got involved. But semantics aside, the phrase stuck, and in practice it becomes shorthand for a very specific kind of 2D design, one where you dropped into a single interconnected world and must explore it gradually, unlocking new areas with new tools or abilities. That's what Symphony of the Night perfected, and what dozens of games since have imitated, which brings us back to Radical Rescue a full 4 years earlier. This unassuming Game Boy title was one of Konami's very first attempts at that formula, making it not just a curiosity, but a sort of prototype blueprint for the style they'd later become famous for. So, let's dive into it. When booting up Radical Rescue, you're treated to a simple but effective intro sequence. This time, Shredder has gone the extra mile. He hasn't just kidnapped April, he's also captured Master Splinter and 3 of the 4 turtles. Only Michelangelo remains, and so begins your mission. Armed with just his nunchucks and raw turtle power, Mikey must infiltrate a massive labyrinthian stronghold, defeat mini-bosses, collect keys, and rescue his brothers one by one. Each rescued turtle adds a new movement ability, gradually expanding your access to previously unreachable parts of the map. The game opens in a wooded area, a gentle onboarding zone that introduces the core mechanics. Michelangelo's default attack is a close-range spin of his nunchuck, and crucially, he can also use them as helicopter blades to hover short distances. This not only allows players to bypass small gaps and reach high branches, but it immediately signals that movement is key to progression. And unlike the previous games, you're not going from point A to point B, you're exploring, you're remembering landmarks, you're finding locked doors and making mental notes of where you'll return once your party expands. It's a bold change, and it works remarkably well. Once inside the main labyrinth, players can press the select button to bring up an in-game map, a surprisingly sophisticated feature for a 1993 Game Boy title. The map displays the full scope of the sprawling environment and marks rooms of interest with small black dots. Health management plays a key role in exploration. Scattered throughout the maze are full pizzas, which can be picked up and stored as healing items, fully restoring a turtle's health when used. Enemies also occasionally drop pizza slices, which offer instant health recovery on the fly. It's a simple system, but one that encourages careful planning and smart resource usage, especially in later sections. Progression through the game hinges on collecting keys, which are earned by defeating bosses and used to unlock the cells holding your fellow turtles. Each time you rescue a brother, you don't just gain a new character, you gain a new mobility power, granting access to areas you previously couldn't reach. It's a classic Metroidvania loop: fight a boss, unlock ability, and explore further. The first major boss is Scratch, a convict-uniformed mutant cat with a cult following in the Turtles toy line. In fact, Scratch's action figure is one of the rarest and most expensive official Turtles toys ever made. Here though, he's a formidable early game challenge. Once defeated, he drops the key needed to rescue Leonardo. Leonardo's signature ability lets him drill vertically downward through certain cracked floor tiles using his twin katanas. This immediately opens new subterranean routes and introduces another layer of verticality to the map. From here, things start to open up dramatically. In addition to boss keys, players will also come across key cards, used to unlock sliding doors and blocked off sections throughout the environment. This further encourages exploration and rewards memory, noting where to return once the right card or ability is found. Next up is Dirtbag, a mutated mole miner from the 1990 cartoon series and Playmates toyline. He's no pushover, launching into the air to deliver crushing axe slams and dishing out uppercuts that send your turtles flying. Beat him and you're free Rembrandt. His powers? he can retract into his shell and slide through tight passages, functionally identical to the Metroid Morph Ball. It's an amusing parallel and a subtle reminder that Radical Rescue is absolutely playing in the same design sandbox as Nintendo's most iconic exploratory series. From here, the game continues to reward experimentation and backtracking. As you chain together abilities and open up new paths, you'll eventually encounter one of the more obscure boss characters, a Triceraton. Hailing from the Mirage comics, the Triceratons are a race of alien dinosaurs who occasionally show up in Turtles media. This one charges like an actual Triceratops and unloads with a machine gun, a satisfying mid-game difficulty spike. Defeating him earns the final Turtle Key, used to free Donatello. Donnie's abilities allow him to climb up vertical walls, adding a whole new dimension to exploration. And once you've assembled the full team, that once overwhelming maze starts to shrink. What once felt closed off now becomes wide open, and it's a deeply satisfying shift in momentum. Eventually, the group encounters Scowtail, a serpentine alien bounty hunter created specifically for this game. He's a nasty piece of work, shooting explosive fireballs from his mouth and darting around the screen with unpredictable speed. Take him down and you'll earn the key to unlock Master Splinter. Once freed, Splinter warns you that your mission isn't over. April O'Neil is still being held captive. He also grants access to a previously sealed off area leading into the final leg of the game. At this point, many players assume they're in the endgame, but Radical Rescue isn't finished just yet. The last stretch of Radical Rescue pulls no punches. Players face a demanding gauntlet of precise platforming, and most notably, a full-blown boss rush. That's right, every major boss you fought earlier in the game returns, one after another, in rapid succession. It's a classic old-school final exam, the kind of challenge that rewards mastery and punishes panic. The layout of this segment, complete with dual sliding doors before each boss, is a blatant homage to Mega Man. It's a neat little nod and a reminder of how closely tied the NES and Game Boy action design DNA really was during this era. Once all prior bosses are re-defeated, the final showdown begins. Shredder in all his glory. As expected, he brings the most intense and varied attack patterns in the entire game, forcing players to combine every skill, reflex and Turtles ability they've learned up to that point. Defeat him and you're rewarded with the final key, the one that frees April O'Neil, bringing the Radical Rescue storyline to its climactic close. And with that, the original Game Boy trilogy of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games reaches its end. Looking back at everything we've covered today, from Fall of the Foot Clan to Back from the Sewers to Radical Rescue, it's clear that Konami wasn't just turning out licensed tie-ins. They were experimenting, evolving, and with each Game Boy entry, they took risks to push the franchise in bold new directions. Radical Rescue in particular stands as a huge departure from what had come before. But was it a change for the better? Well, that's up for debate. The first two Turtles handheld games were straightforward, linear and easy to pick up and play. They captured the cartoon's energy and aesthetic while delivering accessible action platforming that even casual fans could enjoy. Radical Rescue, on the other hand, demands far more from the player. Its labyrinthian structure and Metroidvania mechanics introduce genuine depth, but they also bring with them the pitfalls of getting lost, backtracking, and the occasional sense of aimlessness. And on the tiny monochrome screen of the Game Boy, that's no small hurdle. Back then, without colour or visual variety, areas can blur together, making navigation tougher than it should be. Even Metroid 2 Return of Samus, another genre peer on the same hardware, suffered from this exact problem. Holding such thoughts, one can't help but wonder, what if Radical Rescue had been developed for the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive, with a full-colour screen and richer detail? What if it had been positioned as a precursor to Symphony of the Night before it existed? These are tantalising what-ifs lingering around this little cartridge. Still, despite those limitations, Radical Rescue remains a remarkably ambitious and forward-thinking entry. It's arguably the missing link between Simon's Quest and the golden era of 2D Metroidvanias, the first Konami game to tie meaningful character-specific progression to a sprawling interconnected map. And yet it's often forgotten, overshadowed by flashier titles, bigger systems, and the fading cultural footprint of the Turtles themselves in 1993. But make no mistake, this game matters. Its design fingerprint shows up again and again in Konami's later work, especially in the Castlevania games that would come to define the genre it helped shape. But ultimately, why do these three Game Boy titles deserve our respect? Simple. They weren't just lazy tie-ins or reskinned beat-em-ups, they were bold, inventive, and surprisingly ambitious for such a limited platform. Each entry in the trilogy tried something different, from tight arcade-style action to non-linear by the final game. They respected their audience, pushed the hardware, and delivered more than anyone had any right to expect from a black and green handheld. In an era full of cheap cash grabs, these games dared to be memorable, and that, my friends, is why they still matter. But for all the beloved releases we've discussed, there's one official game that's remained firmly in the shadows, an oddity so overlooked that even die-hard Turtles fans often forget it exists. That's because one corner of the franchise's history, the PC exclusives, remain largely untouched. And among them sits perhaps the most peculiar of all, a 1991 release that dared to break away from the cartoon's colourful chaos and deliver something darker, moodier, and surprisingly mature. This was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Manhattan Missions, a title developed not in-house by Konami Japan, but instead outsourced to a Canadian studio, Distinctive Software. Founded in 1982 by a teenage Don Matrick, yes, the future Xbox executive, and Jeff Sember, Distinctive Software had built its reputation on realism and technical prowess. Their Test Drive and Stunt series were considered benchmarks for racing simulations, earning the team industry respect. By 1990, they were also handling PC conversions of console properties under a secondary division, Unlimited Software Incorporated, including Konami's own Castlevania port for DOS. This prior success likely convinced Konami to trust the Canadians with adapting one of their biggest global licenses. And it wasn't just business as usual, it was part of a wider strategy. At the time, Konami was experimenting with Western-developed PC releases to reach new audiences, commissioning studios like Gremlin, Mirasoft, and the Bitmap Brothers for big box releases aimed at the North American and European computer markets. The fact that it was a PC game and not a console one explains why fewer players have encountered it. Released exclusively for IBM-compatible PCs running MS-DOS, it targeted an entirely different audience, one arguably far smaller, older, and more technically minded than the usual player base. You see, at that time, home computers were still a luxury item, and only around 16.9% of American households owned one when it came out. This meant that PC gaming was dominated by adults with disposable income, not kids trading cartridges in the school playground. That distinction shaped everything about Manhattan Missions. While console games were designed to be instantly accessible, PC titles often demanded patience and technical literacy, installing from floppy disks, editing config.sys files, and sometimes even typing commands to launch the game. In effect, the Turtles PC outing was destined for a smaller, more mature demographic, one that expected sophistication and perhaps a little more grit. Sure, it's incredibly easy to forget how lopsided the market was. For example, according to industry reports, a hit PC game in the early 90s typically sold around 250,000 copies, while a console hit would easily clear 1 million cartridges. As a result, Manhattan Mission was fighting an uphill battle from day one, aimed at a market 1/12 the size of its console counterpart. But then again, that's precisely what makes it so fascinating. And that brings us neatly to what made Manhattan Mission so different, both in how it looked and how it played. By the time Manhattan Missions hit shelves in 1991, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles brand was absolutely everywhere. Turtles Arcade and Turtles in Time had already cemented Konami's reputation for colourful, fast-paced, four-player mayhem, faithfully channeling the popular animated series into pixel-perfect chaos. But Manhattan Missions took a dramatically different approach. Instead of emulating the bright Saturday morning cartoon style, it leaned into the grittier tone of the Mirage Studio comics, the original black and white source material where the Turtles were less cheerful mascots and more grim vigilantes lurking through the shadows of New York. This artistic pivot made perfect sense for a PC release. As Hardcore Gaming 101 points out, the audience was presumed to be older and more technically savvy than that found on the home console systems. Manhattan Missions was very much a product of that push, a serious PC-minded take on a console phenomenon. Ironically, the game would arrive just as Distinctive Software's era as an independent studio came to an end. In June 1991, just as development was wrapping up, Electronic Arts purchased the company for $10 million, absorbing it into what would become EA Canada. That acquisition marks both the end of Distinctive's Konami's partnership and, effectively, their brief time in the world of licensed action titles. But what they left behind was fascinating. Manhattan Missions carried over the developer's trademark focus on realism, evident in everything from its grounded movement physics to its subdued nocturnal tone. The story, drawn directly from Mirage's first issue, opens with a stunning recreation of the comic's iconic second and third pages, rendered as animated panels that unfold like a living comic book. These sequences weren't just a novelty, they were a technical achievement for the time. In an era when most PC games opened with static title cards or scrolling text, Manhattan Missions presented dynamic sequential storytelling that mirrored the rhythm of an actual comic. In 1991, this was unheard of, a genuine translation of comic book language into video game form. So before you've even thrown a punch or eaten a slice of pizza, Manhattan Mission sets a mood unlike any other Turtles game before or since, mature, serious, and drenched in atmosphere. When it comes to gameplay, Manhattan Missions doesn't play anything like its console or arcade counterparts. Instead, it offers something far more in line with Prince of Persia, a style of game that was extremely popular on DOS at the time. The goal is simple enough: complete a series of missions, or rather, Manhattan missions, to ultimately defeat Shredder. Each mission is divided into what the game calls scenes, and unlike the NES or arcade games, Manhattan Missions doesn't feature side-scrolling action. Instead, players move from one static screen to another, navigating a two-dimensional environment. You can both move freely or switch into a combat stance to engage enemies. Rather than being programmed to work best with a controller or arcade-style layout, this title was built entirely around PC keyboard inputs. Players can toggle between walking and fighting modes, arm or sheath their weapons, and make use of each Turtle's trademark weapon, along with the occasional thrown ninja star for ranged attacks. Interestingly, the game also includes some light RPG elements. Each Turtle has strength, speed, and HP stats, all of which can be improved as you progress. Between missions, you can even restore health by resting the Turtles, though resting costs precious time. You're given a total of 48 in-game hours to complete the game and defeat Shredder, so managing your time becomes part of a challenge. Across 16 levels, there's plenty to explore, but not everything is straightforward left to right platforming. You'll climb ladders, drop through manholes, and explore rooms through doors and other access points, giving the environments a more layered comic book-like feel. The developers clearly drew some inspiration from the 1989 NES game they had previously ported, as Manhattan Missions also encourages you to manage your team wisely. You can switch between Turtles at will to keep them balanced and use pizza to restore health in a pinch. One cool feature is that if a Turtle is knocked out, he can be rescued by Casey Jones, marking this popular character's first ever video game appearance. At the end of each stage, players face off against bosses, often accompanied by short cutscenes. It's a nice touch that further helps bring the story to life. While the console games of the time were bright, fast and colourful, Manhattan Missions embraced atmosphere. The streets of New York are drenched in shadow, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of neon or a glint of moonlight on wet pavement. In fact, it could even be said that outside of the arcades at the time, Manhattan Missions was arguably the best looking Turtles game of its day. As mentioned, the opening title screen, for example, is practically a frame-for-frame recreation of pages 2 and 3 from the first Mirage comic, a touch of authenticity that only a studio obsessed with detail could have pulled off. Character design also follows the comics more closely than anything seen before or since. The foot soldiers are lean and menacing, Splinter looks closer to his live-action film counterpart, and Shredder wears the distinctive red armour from the 1990 movie. The Turtles themselves, well, they look fierce. Gone are the cartoon smiles and oversized eyes. Here, they're built like proper street fighters, with grim expressions that make it clear these aren't the sort of lads who would shout cowabunga before a scrap. And then there's the sound design, which is another story entirely. You'd expect thumping 8-bit music, right? Not here. There's no catchy theme tune looping in the background, just ambience. Distant city hums, footsteps echoing through empty alleys, the clang of metal, the smack of weapons. It's different and atmospheric, to say the very least. So yes, Manhattan Mission lacks the high-energy soundtrack of its console cousins, but that seems to have been entirely the point. Its audio design was built for immersion, to make you feel the weight of every punch and every dark, rain-soaked corner of Manhattan. It's the first Turtles game that genuinely feels like a crime story, and that's what sets it apart. This was less Saturday morning cartoon adventure and more a Saturday night vigilante tale. Now, as you can probably imagine, Manhattan Missions wasn't exactly a smash hit. Even at release, very few people actually played it, and fewer still seemed to understand what it was trying to do. To this day, it remains one of the most obscure entries in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. You'll find endless retrospectives on Turtles in Time, on Manhattan Project, on The Hyperstone Heist, but far less about Manhattan Missions. When people do talk about it though, it's often about the game's 48-hour timer. Hardcore Gaming 101 brings this up, for example. For a game that builds tension around the countdown, it could apparently be beaten in less than 30 minutes, if you just run past most enemies and go straight for the bosses. That single design choice undermines much of the game's otherwise clever RPG progression system. Why invest in powering up your Turtles if you can speedrun the game faster than ordering a takeaway? Yet despite all of that, despite the awkward mechanics, the sluggish pacing, and the commercial obscurity, Manhattan Mission still has its defenders. Scary Crayon, a retro site run by longtime fans, describe it as their favourite Turtles game to this day, celebrating its atmosphere, its story presentation, and its ambition. They argued that the training and health management features make this the closest to a bona fide role-playing game that the Turtles have ever seen, and that's really the heart of the matter. This was a game that tried. It wanted to be more than a simple side-scroller. It wanted to capture the tone of the comics, experiment with RPG systems, and tell a story with genuine structure. Yes, it stumbled in execution, but conceptually, it was years ahead of its time. So while Turtles in Time was dazzling players in the arcades, Manhattan Missions was quietly pushing boundaries in a dimly lit corner of the PC gaming world. Forgotten by most, but deeply respected by the few who gave it a fair chance. Today it stands as one of the most interesting failures in the entire franchise, a game that dared to treat its audience like adults long before gritty reboots became a marketing buzzword. It's a game born from ambition, released into obscurity, and remembered mostly by those curious enough to go digging through DOS archives or retro forums. It's one of those fascinating relics from a time when even the biggest franchises weren't afraid to experiment, when publishers like Konami would hand a globally recognisable brand to a team of Canadian programmers and simply say, let's see what happens. And what happened was something strangely brilliant. Not perfect, far from it, but brilliant in its intent. Critics may have dismissed it as clunky, awkward, or even unplayable, but innovation often looks messy in hindsight. For every beloved classic, there are a dozen flawed experiments that walked so others could run, and Manhattan Missions was exactly that. It was the Turtles game that tried to grow up before its audience did. It's the black turtle of the family, forgotten by most but never by those who truly care about where gaming came from, and where it dared to go. Here's where things get spicy. What if I told you fans were making great Turtles games even when professional game developers were not? To understand how Rescue Palooza came into existence, we first need to rewind the clock. Back in 2003, an indie dev group called Senile Team released Beats of Rage, a free fan-made tribute to Streets of Rage that replaced the original characters and sprites with assets from the King of Fighters. What they didn't expect was the game to explode in popularity, racking up over 1 million downloads purely through word of mouth. This unexpected success revealed something the AAA industry had long ignored. Fans were starving for classic-style beat-em-ups, and from the sparks of Beats of Rage, a fire was lit. That fire would become Open Beats of Rage, or Open Bore, an open-source evolution of the engine that let fans and indie creators build their own beat-em-ups from scratch. Over the years, it's been refined and upgraded into what many now call the ultimate 2D engine, a royalty-free powerhouse capable of bringing everything from classic brawlers to entirely new game genres to life, and with that the stage was set for projects like Rescue Palooza to emerge, not just as tributes but as full-blown love letters to the golden age of arcade beat-em-ups. One of the many creators who embraced the power of Open Bore was none other than Merso X, a die-hard Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan and the mastermind behind the game we're showcasing today. While he developed several retro-style PC games over the years, it's his work with the Turtles that truly stands out. Merso credits his inspiration to a moment many retro gamers will relate to, playing Super Mario All-Stars as a kid. For the first time, he witnessed what it looked like when classic 8-bit games were reimagined with updated graphics and music for the Super Nintendo. That moment planted a seed, a dream of seeing every NES game get the same 16-bit glow-up treatment. Years later, with Open Bore at his fingertips, Merso began what started as a faithful 16-bit remake of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project, then expanded to include Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, but the project didn't stop there. What began as a simple remake spiraled into something far more ambitious, the all-out fan celebration known as Rescue Palooza. Early in development, Merso explained that for characters who appeared in the original NES games, like the Turtles themselves, he'd take the original sprites and painstakingly recolor and edit them in Photoshop. This attention to detail was essential in preserving the feel of the source material, while reimagining it all with a slick 16-bit art style worthy of the Super Nintendo era. As Merso continued the painstaking process of remaking the old Turtles games, something inevitable began to happen. He started scrutinizing them more closely. With every sprite he redrew and every mechanic he replicated, he noticed more and more quirks, inconsistencies and gaps between the games and the broader Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles lore. And like many of us obsessive fans, this over-analysis quickly snowballed. But instead of simply brushing it off, Merso made a bold decision to abandon a strictly faithful remaster and instead create something that could surpass the originals altogether. As he put it, I wanted to have some flexibility in terms of enemy placement and behaviour, but I knew that if I were to take these liberties, the game would stop being a faithful adaptation of the originals. So to make it more fun for myself, development-wise, I decided to use the original games just as a template, while creating essentially a new game. This shift in direction led to a much grander vision, a game that wouldn't just reference a Turtles title, but draw from all of them, mixing classic gameplay with deep-cut lore from the animated series and beyond. To get it right, Merso called in the cavalry, mega fans like retro toy blogger Eric Setsky and John Zelenak aka Suaden, the man with the world's largest Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles toy collection, both of whom helped weave accurate story elements and references throughout the project. And while many of the sprites still began as modified versions of NES originals lovingly tweaked in Photoshop, Rescue Palooza demanded much more. With its enormous cast of characters pulled from every corner of the Turtles universe, Merso and his collaborators had to create brand new assets from scratch, transforming this once humble project into a full-blown fan-driven epic. The collaborators helped with everything from sprite editing to lore accuracy, even adapting graphics from completely unrelated games like Sunsoft's Batman, transforming them into brand new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles characters with a bit of pixel magic. But as the scope ballooned, it became clear that reworking existing sprites wasn't always going to cut it. In fact, many characters, including familiar faces from Tournament Fighters, had to be built entirely from scratch, with inspiration drawn directly from the animated series. Ironically, Merso would later reflect that creating new sprites from scratch was actually easier than endlessly editing old ones. But after years of work, Rescue Palooza was finally completed and released to the public on June 13th, 2019, available completely for free via Merso X's website. The official description described it as a free fan-made beat-em-up game based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, an update and homage to the classic NES titles with tons of characters playable for the first time. So now with that said, let's dive into this very game and explore what this fan-driven labour of love truly has to offer. Right off the bat, the game opens with a delightfully simple intro. The Turtles burst through a wall on skateboards before the camera pans stylishly to the title screen. It's short, sharp, and brimming with Saturday morning cartoon energy. However, it's the main story mode is where things kick off, and it's immediately clear this game was made with co-op chaos in mind. Up to 4 players can jump in together, with each person automatically assigned a turtle. But don't worry, you'll soon unlock the ability to switch between a massive roster of characters as you progress. Before the real action begins, players are dropped into a short tutorial. The controls are straightforward, and let's be real, the kind of people booting this game up are likely veteran gamers already fluent in side-scrolling smackdowns. Still, it guarantees that everyone knows what they're doing from the jump. Once you're through the tutorial, the game hits you with a brilliantly tongue-in-cheek cutscene, presented in art that lovingly mirrors the style of the classic NES games. In it, Splinter appears on the television screen and in a completely deadpan tone announces that to commemorate 30 years of bitter rivalry, he decided to kidnap literally everyone the Turtles know. It's absurd, hilarious, and sets the tone perfectly. Your mission? Rescue the entire cast of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles universe. A full-blown Rescue Palooza, if you will, hence the name. From here, fans are dropped straight into a deliciously nostalgic setting, an overworld map modelled directly after the one from the original 1989 NES game. But this time it's been given a Mega Man-style twist, allowing players to choose their stage order however they like. It's a small change, but it gives the game a refreshing sense of freedom that wasn't present in the originals. Select a stage, say April's building, and you'll immediately get the option to switch your turtle. This character swapping feature becomes even more important as the game progresses. Once the action kicks off, you'll recognise the stage layout instantly. It's a loving recreation of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game's iconic first level. Though this time, April's building isn't on fire, which is probably a relief to her insurance provider. Familiar foes from the original game return alongside some fresh additions, and the whole thing is drenched in a gooey layer of nostalgia right down to the pitch-perfect chiptune soundtrack. Just like the NES classic, April is found at the end of a stage, cornered and in peril, but instead of history repeating itself, the game throws a delightful curveball. A mechanical drill erupts through the floor and out pops Rocksteady and Bebop for a chaotic tag team boss battle. It's a brilliant escalation of the original setup, and just when you think it's going to follow the usual script and end with April being kidnapped, boom! Shredder himself bursts from the drill only to be swiftly fended off by a surprisingly capable April. No damsel in distress routine this time, just a triumphant twist on a familiar scene and a satisfying ending to the stage. Now, one of Rescue Palooza's coolest and most rewarding features is the way it handles unlockable characters. After completing each stage, you don't just move on, you're rewarded with new fighters to play as. In the case of April's building, you unlock April herself and both Rocksteady and Bebop. Yes, the bosses you just beat become playable, and that's just a taste of what this fan-made love letter has to offer. As soon as you clear a stage, your new fighters are added to the roster and can be selected immediately on the next level's character select screen. And this isn't just a cosmic swap. Every character comes with their own unique stats, strengths and weaknesses. Some are stronger, others are faster, some better suited to group fights, others to solo runs, making experimentation genuinely fun and strategic. In total, the game boasts a staggering 60 playable characters, pulled from every corner of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles multiverse. We're talking heroes, villains, obscure deep cuts, and fan favourites you'd never expect to control in a side-scrolling beat-em-up, all lovingly rendered and voiced with clips taken straight from the original cartoon. Every level is packed with nods to the classic NES and arcade games, the 1987 animated series, and even the old toy line. The sheer volume of references is borderline overwhelming in the best possible way. It's the kind of game where you'll be constantly pausing to say, wait, they put that guy in here? That's how deep Merso X went into the Turtles vault, cramming decades of lore and fan service into one game that somehow feels like a playable museum of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles history. When it comes to stage design, Rescue Palooza constantly finds ways to surprise you. And one of the most impressive feats pulled off by Merso X is how he seamlessly fuses gameplay elements from the original 1989 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles platformer with the more traditional beat-em-up mechanics found in later titles. It's a crossover within a crossover, and somehow it works well. Take the sewer stage for example. At first glance, it plays like a familiar nod to the platforming-heavy original NES game, but just when you think you know what's coming, boom, you're battling the Pizza Monster, a boss that never appeared in the 1989 title at all. This kind of unexpected twist on nostalgia is everywhere, and it's one of the game's biggest strengths. What really keeps things fresh is how the game constantly remixes old content to create something new. 1 minute you're brawling through Key West from the Manhattan Project, the next you're knee-deep in the snow-covered park stage straight out of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game on NES. There's a real sense that every piece of classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game history has been lovingly dissected, reassembled, and enhanced, not just referenced but celebrated. On top of all of that, the game even introduces bespoke mechanics that never existed in any of the originals. For instance, you can knock enemies off of their vehicles, and then ride them yourself. Think of it as a loving homage to Golden Axe, where you'd hijack mounts mid-fight. It's a fun, unexpected addition that fits the game's chaotic energy perfectly. Combat-wise, things are noticeably tighter and more responsive than the NES originals. While it doesn't quite reach the fluidity of Turtles in Time or Hyperstone Heist, it's definitely a step up from the old-school jank. Characters can run, jump and perform a variety of attacks, and each one also gets a special move activated with a single button press once a meter fills. That meter recharges slowly over time, keeping special moves accessible but not spammable. It's this mix of refined combat, nostalgic level design and fresh mechanics that makes Rescue Palooza feel like more than just a fan game. It's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles greatest hits remix, with new tracks, new features and a deep cut dedication that most official releases could only dream of matching. Now, when it comes to Rescue Palooza's massive roster of 60 playable characters, let's be honest, not all fighters are created equal. Some are absolute powerhouses, others not so much, but frankly, I love that. This modern obsession with perfectly balanced rosters, it's a bit much. Life isn't fair or symmetrical, so why should our games be? I'll take a roster with wild highs and laughable lows over one where every fighter feels like a carbon copy. Give me chaos. Give me jank, give me flavour. Between certain stages, the game also throws in bonus rounds, introduced by none other than Cuddly the Cowlick. The trans-dimensional floating cowhead straight out of the old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics. Yes, that's a real character. These mini-games give players the chance to earn extra lives, adding a light-hearted break from the main action and giving you a bit of a leg up when the going gets tough. And once you've cleared story mode, that's when arcade mode unlocks, letting you dive back in and play through a condensed arcade style version of the game as any of the 60 characters. It's the kind of feature that adds real longevity to a fan-made title, giving you every excuse to keep coming back and trying out the full cast. Now, with so many characters, stages, references and mechanics packed into this thing, I could sit here breaking down every pixel for another hour, but I won't, because Rescue Palooza is filled with so many cameos, Easter eggs and delightful surprises that it's best experienced firsthand. And since it's completely free to download and play, there's really no excuse not to. Upon its release in June of 2019, Rescue Palooza was met with widespread acclaim from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fans and retro gaming communities alike. Players were quick to praise the game's sheer ambition, a free fan-made title that offered more content, characters and callbacks than most official Turtles games had in years. Many hailed it as a love letter to the franchise that truly understood what fans wanted, combining nostalgic authenticity with unexpected depth. Across online forums and comment sections, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Fans celebrated the game's sprawling roster, creative use of lore, and thrill of seeing obscure characters brought to life with care and attention to detail. There was a genuine sense of surprise that such a feature-rich and polished experience had emerged not from a major publisher, but from a passionate community effort. While some players did note that the gameplay wasn't quite as fluid or refined as arcade classics like Turtles in Time, most were happy to overlook that, acknowledging that the limitations of the engine and the scale of the project. A few mentioned minor bugs or performance quirks, but these were considered small issues in the context of everything the game offered. Overall, Rescue Palooza was seen as a triumph, not just as a fan project, but as one of the most enjoyable and comprehensive Turtles games available. It filled a gap left untouched by the mainstream industry for years, and proved just how much heart and creativity fans can bring to a beloved franchise when given the right tools. So why not give this one a go for yourself? Rescue Palooza is completely free to download, packed with content and made with more love than most modern games can dream of. If you're even remotely a fan of the classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, there's absolutely no reason not to dive in and see what all the fuss is about. Shredder's Revenge, a beat-em-up for the ages, and one of my personal favourites of the modern era. So to further illustrate Shredder's Revenge's greatness, let me first take you back to a different time. 2012, the year of the London Olympics, the Arab Spring, and a terrible movie about the end of the world. The period is well known for many things, but one of them certainly isn't beat-em-ups. In fact, game journalist of IGN, Mitch Dyer, would do an epic job of showing to us just how much the mainstream gaming media at the time seemed to loathe the genre. Not only burying Double Dragon Neon in his review of the game that year, but in the process burying the entire genre as a whole. In his scathing piece he would write, "Let's address a sad truth nobody wants to hear. The brawler genre is not very good anymore." The beat-em-up was built on the back of arcade game design. Difficulty didn't come by design, but by consequence of clunky mechanics meant to scam kids out of more quarters. Regarding the genre, he would add, it is afraid to let go of the 80s altar it worships at, even if it means cramming a crummy, archaic experience down players' throats. Mitch Dyer, along with many other gaming journalists, had written off an entire genre as old, dated garbage that would never make a comeback. But fast forward a decade later, and it becomes clear that this ignorant write-up could not have been more wrong. While Mitch would move on to writing plots for dubious Star Wars games on behalf of EA, the beat-em-up genre would go from strength to strength, delivering to us classic after classic, with Streets of Rage 4 sitting atop the mountain as arguably the best of the whole bunch. This is of course debatably until we got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, a game that has proved once and for all that beat-em-ups are popular and mainstream again. What is interesting though about this Turtles game is that it has clearly been inspired by the Turtles arcade classics. But at the same time, the game's heritage is just as much rooted in the 21st century as it is linked to the arcade hits. and it also goes a hell of a long way in explaining this game's high pedigree. To grasp this further, all we need to do is look at the development studio behind the title, known as Tribute Games, who are based out in Montreal, Canada. Back in 2007, key staff members from Tribute Games worked at Ubisoft Montreal, with them developing a criminally underrated Turtles beat-em-up for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance hardware. This hidden gem was by far the greatest Ninja Turtles video game since the franchise's arcade days, delivering a fun and addictive brawler in an era in which the genre was practically dead. Most who have played this game though, including myself, describe a high caliber experience that certainly deserves some extra attention. However, this would not be the only brawler from Ubisoft Montreal, as fast forward another 3 years, we would get the surprisingly brilliant Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. This shockingly good video game, based on the now cult favourite movie of the same name, was a brilliantly fun effort, offering up the best beat 'em up that the world had seen in many years. Not bad at all for a digital only game made for Xbox Live and the PlayStation Network. But it tells you all you need to know about the level of respect that the genre was getting at the time. Even the very best games were receiving little in the way of a marketing push or fanfare. Since it was a digital only game, fast forward to December the 30th 2014, the game would be delisted from digital stores, but fortunately this would not be the last we would see of this one. Fans would beg for years to see this video game brought back, which is exactly what would happen 7 years later in 2021, 11 years after the game's initial release. Not only was the game made readily available across all modern digital storefronts, but even physical versions of the game were manufactured this time around. With games like this, Streets of Rage 4, River City Girls and Fighting Rage being on the market simultaneously, it was clear the beat-em-up renaissance period was here. And with games like Final Vendetta and River City Girls 2 on the horizon, it has looked like things would only get better. Speaking of this new golden age for the arcade-style brawler, publishers of Streets of Rage 4, Dotemu, would shock the world once more, when on March the 10th, 2021, they would drop a trailer for another beat-em-up that had previously only seemed like the stuff of dreams. The magical trailer would blare out a remixed version of the classic Ninja Turtles theme tune, laid over the top of some awesome animated visuals reminiscent of the 80s American cartoon favourite. The best though was yet to come, as gameplay was quickly revealed of an all-new beat-em-up based on the arcade originals. This video would display that the game would be able to be played with at least 4-player cooperative play, and the title, full of beautiful sprite work, was being developed by none other than Tribute Games, the Montreal development studio where key staff members work, who not only brought to us Scott Pilgrim, but of course the previous decent Turtles brawler. The combination of these guys working with Dotemu, the Streets of Rage 4 publishers, made me feel like we were in very safe hands indeed. But of course, the game now had a hell of a lot of hype to live up to. As great as this game looked from the trailers, everyone was more than aware that delivering a game of the same caliber as Turtles Arcade and Turtles in Time would be a tall order indeed, but staff at Tribute Games would toil away to try and make this dream a reality. Development would progress, and Dotemu would reveal more and more about the game on their YouTube channel page. But some of the coolest info on the game would begin to be published on April 13th 2022, with the publisher releasing videos documenting the development process. Jean-Francois Major, the technical director of Tribute Games, would sit down for a coffee with Dotemu executive producer Cyrille Imbert, where they would discuss the project's inception. Major notes that he grew up with the franchise and dressed up as Donatello for Halloween as a child, with the Turtles forever being present in his life since. Imbert states that after finding success working on Streets of Rage 4, his company were keen to publish another huge beat-em-up and would open discussions with Nickelodeon about the possibility of making a new Turtles game. It would be here that Imbert and company would learn that another company had pitched to them the same idea, which was of course Tribute Games, resulting in the two companies deciding that this was the perfect opportunity to team up and clean shell. They also raise that with the boom in popularity of retro gaming and nostalgia in general, that the bringing back of the 1987 Turtles seemed like a lucrative move that would make sense. The fully animated trailer, with the theme from the original show featuring gameplay full of stunning pixel art, was exactly what gamers and long-time Turtles fans were hungry for. In a further upload to the Dotamu channel, we also got to learn more about the games from Frederick Gemus, Shredder's Revenge's designer, who brings up that he used to harass his parents to allow him to play the Turtles at the arcades. The game's director, Jonathan Levine, who also worked on the 2007 GBA game, brings up the core fun factors with the new game will be the tone, the upbeatness, and all of the crazy characters of the series. That, when paired with the game's multiplayer aspect, will deliver a pick up and play experience that is perfect to enjoy with friends and family. He also mentions that he went back and played all of the old games at the start of the production, noting that with the classic arcade games that the pacing is so fast they play almost like shoot 'em ups, with enemies entering the screen in patterns, with players having to get into a rhythm to beat the stages. It was key to include this sort of pacing if they wanted a game that felt like the best Turtles of yesteryear. Stages would be designed like episodes, with the DNA of the game being reminiscent of the classic 80s cartoon. Gemus would also add that a story mode and arcade mode would both be included so that old school gamers could play the game like those from the old days, or players could opt for a more casual experience, with stages over a world map featuring challenges and more. How super easy the game was to jump in and out of was an essential ingredient that the developers wanted in Shredder's Revenge. They would also bring up how exciting it was to be introducing April and Master Splinter to the game, to not only bring in playable characters who were different from the Turtles, but also because the characters have been hanging out with the heroic foursome for so long. In terms of the rest of the game's cast, Gemus mentions that he wanted the game to include as large a scope of different characters together as possible, drawing comparisons with a 90s kid playing with all of their Turtles action figures simultaneously. Also mentioning that the game would be littered with cameos and Easter eggs that old school fans would appreciate. Gemus would describe what they worked on as the ultimate arcade beat 'em up game. Its gameplay is fast and all about ploughing through hordes of foot soldiers, focusing more on crowd control and getting rid of enemies quickly, rather than focusing on technical one-on-one combat like the wonderful Streets of Rage 4. Adam Marin, the game's art director, adds that from the beginning the art team's goal was simple, but lofty. We wanted to give Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fans a chance to relive the series' classic 80s beat 'em up action, with a greater than ever sense of personality felt in each individual asset. To get there, they drew on decades of classic continuity, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, films and cartoons. Justin Sear, the animation supervisor for the game, adds that since the 1987 incarnation of the show is so distinct, it has involved him going back a lot over the old shows and the old games. There's been a lot of research involved looking at what makes each character distinct and coming up with animations that reflected that. Running cycles, for example, were different to match each character, reflecting their unique quirks. Yannick Belziz, the game's scriptwriter, mentions that he went back and watched old episodes for the project too, for character-specific and environment-specific info. The game's composer, T. Lopez, brings up that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the first Saturday morning cartoon that he can remember watching, and never imagined making music for such a game. He would create music for the game inspired by music from the classic show, such as the track reminiscent of Channel 6's theme, for example, that would help throw the player into that environment on the game's opening stage. When composing the game's tracks, Lopez states that with a game like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he felt it needed kick-ass beats for the action factor, but also for old instruments that were used back in the day that people will recognise from those times. Lopez was so thorough in his approach that he would obtain sounds from the same sources as the composers from years ago, researching old video games, movies, for TV series, all absorbing information from a variety of sources. He describes that transcribing the Turtles into music had a lot to do with the music's attitude, reflecting what was going on screen, often creating tracks that old school fans were going to identify with. So, after a 2-year development cycle and a lot of love, respect and hard work being pumped into the game by a passionate and driven team, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is at last finally here. In Dotamu's own words, the company describes this gem as being a video game that features modernised gameplay rooted in timeless classic brawling mechanics. They pitch Turtles as a video game whereby players must bash their way through gorgeous pixel art environments and slay tons of hellacious enemies while using their favourite Ninja Turtle. Each character has their own skills and moves, making a run with each unique. Players can pick a fighter, use radical combos to defeat their opponents, and experience intense combat loaded with breathtaking action and outrageous ninja abilities. You can grab your best friend and play with multiple simultaneously. Powering the game on for the first time, gamers will be dazzled by the startup animation first seen in the game's trailer, featuring the original Turtles theme, which is enough to get any player's blood flowing. Now, we mentioned earlier that the game contains both an arcade and story mode, with there being cutscenes present that help push the game's narrative along. As for this game's story, it starts out with Bebop and Rocksteady assaulting Channel 6 and stealing super gnarly devices to support Krang and Shredder's latest twisted plan. Throughout this adventure, the Turtles battle across a righteous range of timeless locations from the franchise that help make the experience feel all the more authentic. From Manhattan and Coney Island to city rooftops and dank sewers, there was an assortment of varied themed stages to get through, trouncing foot soldiers, triceratons and rock troops all along the way. Playing through this game myself, one of the main things I took from it is what a huge beat 'em up this is, with the title offering up a massive experience featuring a total of a whopping 16 different stages. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this is the longest arcade style beat 'em up I have ever played through, with this unique brawler offering up an insane amount of variety from its stages to all of the crazy different bosses to take out. This mind-blowing nostalgia fest essentially brings along old school gameplay that has been enhanced through the use of its super fresh mechanics. This is emphasised through the game's brawling mechanics that have plenty in common with the games of old, but brings plenty of new elements to the table too. What I mean by this is that you can perform classic moves such as the jumping diving kick, or perform the iconic manoeuvre of picking up an opponent, then comically hurling them towards your viewing monitor. It is touches like this that help make the game feel in tune with the greatness that came before it. But to be fair, not only do the Turtles have richer general movesets than what came before, with manoeuvres that are unique to each in-game character, but the game also introduces what is essentially a combo meter, with fighters able to build it up by performing combos against opponents. Once this is filled up, the selectable characters can perform huge satisfying attacks that can do a lot of damage to a lot of enemies at once, which I must say is not only a hell of a lot of fun to do, but it also further emphasises how quick gameplay in this one can be. There is a lot of moves to gain experience with, and in story mode you can level up to unlock new super attacks, gain additional life and extend the ninja power bar. Combat wise, this is by far the deepest Turtles brawler yet, and that is without even mentioning the varied double teams that are possible and the ability to give health to a co-op partner. There are many layers to the beat 'em up action in this expertly crafted future classic. It's not just the fighting in this one that is top notch though, but also of course the graphics. Now we have already gone through some of the lengths that the development team went through to make this game the most pleasurable experience possible, and the title's gorgeous pixel renders are yet another reason to love this lunacy. The game's signature locales in this one are brimming with detail, and constant callbacks to the show and video games of yesteryear are present. There is so much I could talk about with regards to this element of the game, however I feel video clips I've used throughout can get away with doing the talking for me. As you can see, the game is stunning and is chock full of carefully drawn characters that ooze personality and charm. With regards to the characters, one of my favourite things about the game is of course the many memorable boss battles. particularly in the later portions of the game where I was forced to think on my feet a little more. Each of these opponents requires a different strategy to defeat, with some of these processes becoming more complex as we progress through the game. The final throws was definitely my favourite portion, with boss battles not only being inventive, but somehow often being nostalgic simultaneously. Take this fight with Chrome Dome for example, where he at points punches you from afar as you fight him from his first person perspective. This boss design is reminiscent of a Shredder battle in the Super Nintendo version of Turtles in Time. I must say the boss fight against the Statue of Tyranny also provides the fun visual and an epic feeling boss encounter, but nothing quite matched up to getting to face off against Super Shredder, an opponent who feels invincible at first until you learn his patterns and strike in his moments of weakness. Destroying Kevin Nash's quads to ensure he would not bother me again was a satisfying experience to say the least. There is only one Big Daddy cool around here, and he wears a top hat. Yeah. The story mode provides some nice additional features, such as additional items to find within stages, and even being able to unlock Casey Jones as the secret 7th playable fighter. A fan favourite of a fighter who fans have been desperate to see as a playable in an official classic arcade style Turtles game for as long as the character has existed. Shredder's Revenge also marks the first Turtles game of this kind where you have the option to incredibly play the game with up to 6 people cooperatively, both locally and online. An awesome feature that has made this my all-time favourite 6-player beat 'em up, surpassing the memorable X-Men arcade. The whole video game is laced together with a banging original soundtrack, which as mentioned was composed by T. Lopez, which in my opinion fits the theme and feel of the game perfectly. Like much of the rest of this game, it all sounds quite familiar, yet at the same time sounds so fresh. Since beating story mode, I am highly keen to play this game more so that I can continue to take in the atmosphere and complete more of the challenges. I loved everything about this game, and I feel it built on the likes of Turtles in Time and Turtles Arcade perfectly, presenting a modern experience that still has plenty of callbacks that remind us of a time that makes us all feel warm and fuzzy. But these are just the opinions of one man, me. So rather than just take my word for it, let's hear what the mainstream gaming media had to say. IGN, the company who had a journalist write off beat 'em ups completely 10 years ago, would summarise, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is exactly what it looks like. A lovingly crafted reimagining of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade beat 'em ups from one of the best beat 'em up developers in the business today. It's the perfect game to have in the library for when a group of friends come over and you want to play something that's simple, fun, and can be comfortably finished in a single sitting. Destructoid would add, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is a delightful celebration of the heroes in a half shell. More importantly, it's simply a hell of a lot of fun to play. For anyone who ever jumped off of a schoolyard wall, tree branch in hand shouting "Cowabunga," Shredder's Revenge is absolutely worth shelling out for. GameSpot would write, the game is a tremendous labour of love that lives up to the legacy of Turtles in Time and the brawlers that came before it. Combat is fast paced and simple yet satisfying, while new features help modernise the action without tampering with its 16-bit essence. Rehashing a classic retro game is always a tough ask, but Shredder's Revenge avoids the obvious pitfalls and successfully brings about the revival of everyone's favourite Mutant Turtles. The game, with its high quality on release, would receive unanimous praise across the board, but a few years removed from all of this, there are now more reasons to love this epic title than ever. On August 31st, 2023, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge's Dimension Shellshock DLC would see release, an additional wave of content that made this already excellent game even better. Dimension Shellshock is an exciting DLC expansion that builds on the foundation of Shredder's Revenge by introducing a range of new features and content. In doing so, it enriches the experience with fresh characters, a novel survival mode, and various customization options, making it an attractive addition for fans of the series. One of the most notable features of Dimension Shellshock DLC was the introduction of 2 new playable characters. These include Usagi Yojimbo, the iconic samurai rabbit from the Usagi Yojimbo comics, who makes his debut bringing his distinct sword fighting skills and martial prowess to the game. His combat style is both fluid and powerful, making him a unique addition to the roster. Then we have Karai, a character deeply rooted in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles lore, with ties to the Foot Clan. Known for her agility and electrifying attacks, she adds a dynamic new fighting style to the lineup. These characters expand the game's already rich combat diversity, providing even more exciting options to us players and plenty of fresh techniques and combos to master. Building on this, as mentioned, the DLC's survival mode offers a twist on the traditional beat-em-up formula. In this mode, players can travel across various dimensions, each with their own distinct enemies, challenges and visual themes. As players progress, they collect crystals that enable them to shift between these dimensions, keeping the gameplay engaging and unpredictable. This dimension hopping mechanic introduces a sense of variety. As players survive increasingly difficult waves of enemies, they can unlock permanent upgrades, power-ups, new moves and different colour schemes for characters, creating a satisfying sense of progression that keeps the mode compelling and rewarding. What's more is that in addition to the new gameplay modes, the DLC features new music and visuals that enhance the overall experience. The fresh tracks maintain the retro aesthetic that Shredder's Revenge is known for, while introducing energetic and thematic music that complements the dimension-hopping adventures. This variety in visuals helps to keep the game feeling fresh, even for players who have spent countless hours with the base game, or perhaps years at this point. Thankfully, the DLC maintains the game's strong multiplayer experience, ensuring that all new content can be enjoyed with friends both locally and online. This feature is particularly important as it allows players to tackle the challenges of survival mode together, making the dimension hopping experience more engaging and more cooperative. While this stood out as a significant expansion, at the September 2024 PlayStation State of Play event, even more DLC was announced for the game, making Shredder's Revenge even richer. As outlined by the PlayStation blog, the Radical Reptiles DLC introduces two new characters, Mona Lisa and Mondo Gecko. Mona Lisa, a once human scientist turned mutant salamander, brings her cheery attitude to battle against the Foot Clan, and Mondo Gecko, the coolest cement surfing mutant, joins forces in this action-packed DLC. They outline that Mona boasts a unique fling slam, super flying kick and multiple projectile attacks with special braking animations, making her a beginner-friendly ranged character. Her science background is expressed through her chemistry equipment, and fun details like her 90s toy blowfish mace are included to delight fans. They add that Mona Lisa's design process was more relaxed and natural compared to Mondo, thanks to her naturally flowing shapes and graceful movements. Her design emphasises her playful yet fierce combat style. Mona's projectile-based attacks offer a fresh gameplay experience, making her stand out in melee situations, especially in multiplayer sessions. As for Mondo Gecko, they note that he is known for his laid-back attitude and legendary skateboarding tricks. Mondo's design and development was a challenge for the devs at Tribute. Integrating his skateboard into various animations, including attacks and being hit, posed significant technical challenges. Mondo's aerial acrobatics and bounce attacks make him a dynamic and highly effective fighter. His super attacks are spectacular, with the ground version featuring pyrotechnic effects and breakdancing moves, while the air version delivers a powerful single hit with fire thrusters. Inspiration for Mondo's design came from 80s and 90s skateboarding tricks, creating a visually and mechanically engaging character. The developers ensured his animations and moveset addressed players' feedback on air control, making him a fun and satisfying addition to the roster. On top of yet another two characters to players, a free update to the game adds a new remix of the original soundtrack, broadening the appeal of this already legendary beat-em-up even further. Through the love and attention to detail that continues to be put in when crafting this game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge remains beloved by fans for its nostalgic yet fresh take on the classic beat-em-up genre, capturing the essence of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade roots. It offers vibrant pixel art, smooth animations, and a dynamic soundtrack that perfectly encapsulate the spirit of the original 1980s cartoon. It balances retro-inspired gameplay with modern mechanics perfectly, making it accessible to both longtime fans and newcomers, all while paying homage to the beloved franchise's history with its multiple DLC updates, with this one just keeping on getting better and better. Anyway, don't forget I can get you a huge discount on this game, along with up to 90% off on thousands of others too, simply by using my affiliate link. I hope you treat yourself to some lovely games today, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheerio.